Okay, you got a thing that says like Yuri's recording the call, or?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, everyone, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. So honored and excited about the program. We welcome back the brilliant and beautiful Inside and Out, Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a university educator of political science. She's a poet, and she's also, and I say this as a compliment, a social racial justice warrior and an anti-imperialist activist. She's also a radio show host and is a passionate advocate of abolitionism. She's my guest, so let's get into it. So first of all, Ms. Jones, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
It's a real honor to have you back. But I wanted to have you back when it was Black History Month. But you know what? Every day's a Black History Month for us, so it's no problem. No, Vince. Yeah, it's a real honor to have you back on the program. Oh, and I also forgot, you're also the author of a book of poetry called "Live from the African Resistance."
Yes.
Which I recently got. It was a very late Christmas present, but I was so happy that I finally got it. So excited to.
Yeah, my new book's out in the fall. I think October, maybe.
Oh, and it's going to be a collection of poetry again, or?
No, it's mostly it's called Abolitionist Intimacies. It's on prison work. So.
Ooh, I'm looking.
Yeah.
Oh, that's gonna be fantastic. Well, we have to have you back on the show. We have to have you back on the show to do that, and we're going to get into those issues today. And actually, just before we get into the interview, I just have to give a very quick message, which is we here at 1+1, which is me, myself, and an imaginary friend of mine. We want to wish a very happy congratulations to Bianca Mugeni, the director of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and Eve Engler, my frequent champion who's on the show, the fine Canadian historian, media critic, and geocritic, journalist, and anti-imperialist activist and thinker. And they've welcomed a baby girl in their life, Yuri. So Yuri Engler Mugeni or Zui Mugeni Engler, one of the two. So we hope all is well with the family as they welcome their this new gift in their life, and wish them nothing but peace, love, and happiness. And of course to Joshua, who's I hope that he's going to be enjoying his new role as a big brother. So hopefully we get them on the show in these days. And yeah, congratulations to them. All right, so on to my guest. So my first question then. So my first question I wanted to ask you, Ms. Jones, is when I last had you on the show, you were talking to me about a prisoner called Randy Riley. What's happening with his plight? And before you talk about that, remind our audience the Randy Riley case.
Yeah, so Randy Riley, and if you have a chance to get the book Until We Are Free, which is about the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, there's an essay that I co-wrote with Randy in that book, and that reviews a lot of the experiences in his case. You can also go to whoisrandyriley.com and find out more about his story. But briefly, Randy Riley is an African Nova Scotian man from the community of Cherrybrook. So this is the long-standing historic Black community in Nova Scotia, descended from escaped and liberated enslaved people. And he was wrongfully convicted of murder. Somebody else confessed on the stand to this murder. During the appeal process, it emerged, for example, that the police officer had lied on the stand. The one witness they had has recanted his statement and basically said that, they told me that if I didn't lie, like if I didn't testify, like they said to me, you can either be the suspect in this case or you can be the witness, take your choice. They actually paid him off, which the Crown, of course, knew, but did not come out in the court case in the trial. So he has recanted and also talked about how basically testifying ruined his life, like that act of lying. These are childhood friends, right? So telling that lie against his friend that resulted in conviction. So a lot of Crown misconduct, a lot of police misconduct in the case. He's currently out on bail after a successful appeal, but that doesn't come back into court until, I believe, June. So he's still facing retrial. They have not exonerated him. So, we hope for the best. But of course, in the court system, he could potentially get reconvicted and we could be going through all of this again. But this time, at least we have like, I mean, it'd be very difficult to, I mean, how do you have a witness, even if he then changes story again? This is a witness who's already impeached himself. There's so many clear miscarriages that one would hope that a jury would see that. It's a bit outrageous that the case is even moving forward at this point.
I was just about to say how can they do this from scratch again when it's like, why would they even want to waste the taxpayers' dollars? It's like, okay, we got this wrong, and here, just have some money and just have some compensation money, and let's
you actually don't get compensation unless you actually
pursue it.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't even get it in this case. It's very hard to get compensation money, even in like an exoneration of the type of like, I wasn't even in the country kind of thing. And it's not very good compensation either. But my understanding is that the Crown has tunnel vision and genuinely seems to believe that he did it and really feels that he's getting away with something here. So they are ideologically committed to this prosecution. So I suppose that's all I should say on an open case right now. But I mean, I hope they're not watching like Belgian YouTube.
I doubt it. Unless well, I don't know. I have a Russian name, so they could possibly shut me down for being like Russian states affiliated, which I'm not. But who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of this is in the public record anyway. So, but I mean, it's very representative of our court system, of the kind of prosecutions of Black men in particular. Although I know many cases, I also work on many cases with Black women who are certainly facing miscarriages of justice, if not wrongful convictions. So yeah, it's quite outrageous case. But the case he was supposed to be on trial in October, but the Crown had like surgery or something, so it was put off until June. So hopefully it goes well in a couple of months, but fingers crossed, I guess.
Exactly, and I hope it all goes well, and while on the topic, which we're going to get deeper into, I did get the chance to read Robin Maynard's tour de force of a book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present, and people should really get that book. There are so many incredible stories that that Robin highlights, and what's incredible about her is like she included every single Black person, from the trans to the sex worker and so forth, and to those who are innocent, and to those who they're guilty of whatever crime, but it's so punitive, the punishment and whatnot, that people should get that book, and we really do hope that everything works out with Ramsey, who is out on bail now, right?
Yes, but he has to have like a monitoring bracelet. He can only leave his house in the company of a surety, and in fact, it is quite generous bail conditions, one supposes, like compared to what it could be. Like he's allowed in the yard, but I mean, for example, the cost of the bracelet was initially, until the Crown had surgery, that cost was his family and we were responsible for that cost, which is like $600 a month. So you see how much of these things in the justice system are also downloaded onto family, onto friends. So like the cost of electronic monitoring, which is a condition of release, for example. So the injustice.
Even that comes out of the prisoner's own pockets.
Yeah. When they require a bracelet, legal aid doesn't necessarily cover them. It really depends. So once the Crown delayed the case, I was able to get legal aid to cover it, because I said, we committed to this understanding there'd be for a certain amount of months, and the delay isn't our end. So we were able to get it covered, but we had to eat like 6 months of it.
Wow, oh lordy, that's just unbelievable. That's well, the long, freedom is a constant struggle, isn't that what they always say? Mm-hmm. Unbelievable though, but yeah, I hope all goes well with him, and we'll definitely have to have you back on the program to discuss that. And while on the subject, what are some of the cases of anti-Black state terrorism, police brutality you want people to know about? And are there still protests happening across the country decrying institutional racism that Black and Indigenous communities face, or has that been
Well,
tamed for the moment.
I mean, I'm sure people followed the convoy, like the so-called Freedom Convoy.
Oh yeah.
Which was the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers. And so, of course, there was much discourse around the different treatment of that as opposed to the way that Black and Indigenous protesters have been treated over the years. So, for example, in Ottawa 2 years ago, there was a protest, like a kind of sit-in outside the police station by Indigenous and Black people around defunding the police. And on the day where they were supposed to meet with city councilors in the morning at like 3 a.m., they were all arrested and charged. And that was like over a dozen Black and Indigenous people were charged for just being on the sidewalk, like outside the police station. Of course, as we saw from the convoy, who blocked off downtown for weeks, were honking their horns nonstop and disobeying an injunction that was actually passed to stop that. Of course, all kinds of information has come out that police were donating to this, donating to the Give, Send, Go. So long after the GoFundMe had been shut down and this had all been declared illegal, police were donating to this while then getting overtime to so-called police it. They clearly had intelligence that, like, it was very well known that they were going to, occupy downtown. This was all over their channels. So either they didn't know, meaning that they're not monitoring the channels of right-wing people, while they, of course, monitor Black lives and Indigenous activists, including Cindy Blackstock, who is an advocate for Indigenous children and welfare, who has been spied on by the government for many, many years. And the court ruled that the government was negligent and that Indigenous children were not receiving the same amount of support, like financially. So they weren't paying for as much money for Indigenous kids in care, resulting in all these cases of neglect. And the government has continued to challenge that case despite the court ruling. And Cindy Blackstock, who has led that challenge, has been under government surveillance. That has emerged. I'm sure many people saw over the years. There was a story, I believe, last year about with Wet'suwet'en. So this is on the West Coast.
And that still is happening. That still is happening.
Yes, that's been ongoing. So people may have followed how the police were planning on snipers to like remove grandmothers from their own traditional territories. In the winter, we saw so Six Nations, which is Mohawk, Ganasakaki. Like if people have seen the Oka documentary, 270 Years of Resistance, I think it's called, by Alanis Obawasan. So that reservation, like that nation. So they have all been on ongoing land defense. This is the land back movement in particular, where they successfully fought off like condo developers on their land. And many of those organizers, including Skylar Williams, went out to Wet'suwet'en in solidarity with the people in Wet'suwet'en and were arrested out there, put in dog cages as they were transported, brought into court in their underwear. Like they were told they could only have one layer of clothing. This is in the middle of winter in Canada, right? So we've seen this crackdown on protesting of Black and Indigenous people really intensify in Canada. Beverly Bain, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the other author off the top of my mind, so sorry, other author, but Beverly Bain and another author did a report for No Pride in Policing about this, like showing the intensification of policing, the crackdown on protests. And then, of course, we get the convoy, where white people are given, carte blanche for weeks to protest, which I think was actually deliberate for the police to then engage in what happened, which was, of course, the Emergency Act was invoked. And then we got a lot of policing theater. And we know the police love to perform that on camera and then, have everybody go like, this is why we need police. So they engineered a crisis, I think. Part of it was engineering a crisis to, then claim they needed resources. And of course, part of it was they sympathized with these were white supremacist organizers, right? And this is like about white freedom. So, as I pointed out, very early in the first wave of COVID, I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Dr. Ngola. So this is a Congolese doctor in New Brunswick who was accused of basically spreading COVID to New Brunswick. So he had gone to, his wife had to return to a funeral and was in Quebec with their daughter. He drove through to Quebec to pick up the daughter and came home. And then there was a COVID outbreak and he was all but named by the premier of the province. So all the identifying a doctor like in this place. So it was very obvious that it was him. And he received a deluge of racist threats. He was basically run out of the province on the heels of racist threats. And then it turned out that it wasn't true, that COVID was circulating long before he got it in New Brunswick. He didn't pick it up in Quebec. He got it in New Brunswick, but was accused of spreading COVID. And of course, there was no Freedom Convoy that was sent at that point. There was another student from the Congo in PEI, a young man named Javon, who was arrested for breaking COVID quarantine during a mental health crisis and actually jailed for breaking COVID. So we saw over and over again, particularly in the first wave when there was that particular intense relying on policing, that it was Black people that were overwhelmingly being policed for breaking COVID measures. And of course, that didn't raise any problems. In fact, any of us who spoke out about that were criticized as, like wanting to spread COVID ourselves. So there was certainly no Freedom Convoy. And of course, that illustrates that as long as it's Black on freedom, that is a natural state of things. Like, that's fine. So the people who are all about, anti-vax mandates weren't about what I call the Black skin mandate in this country. They haven't joined with us to protest racial profiling or, many of the same people who, like the same politicians, conservative politicians who went and shook hands with the convoy, support policing the border, right? Canada closed our borders to refugees like many other countries, which is illegal under international conventions, and there was no convoys around freedom of movement. But then a white person can't go to like Boston Pizza without showing proof of vaccination, and that's a crisis. So all of that to say that yes, like the repression is and has been ongoing. But when Black people, Indigenous people have been protesting, we have faced particular crackdowns. I guess I'll put in a plug for this. I don't know when this is going to air, but there is a scholar strike on the 23rd and 24th. You can look up Beverly Bain's Twitter that is engaging some of these issues like abolition defunding, like the state of protesting, etc. So that would be from where we're talking next week. I don't know when people are watching, but if it's before March 23rd and 24th, if it's after, you can go on YouTube and find the scholar strike YouTube and see a lot of the talks on that, which features a lot of activists, scholars, etc.
I'll definitely make sure to also put it in the pinned comment sections on the YouTube. And I wasn't going to bring up the the Freedom Convoy, but I did just want to say like one thing though about the Freedom Convoy is because me and my friend Jay Watts, the central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, we were both like horrified when we were up late on Twitter looking at so many left-leaning folk like praise like the Freedom Convoys, like this is some great like left-wing populist like revolts, and like I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay guys, like putting aside whether the vax is like 100% safe, I don't want to get into that conversation, but just the fact of the matter is like you could so tell like the red flags were all there that this is not some left-wing like people power movement. This was a far right and dare I say reactionary reactionary movement. And like it's one and another thing, like it's one thing to be like protesting against like vaccines because you think that the vaccine isn't safe and you read such and such an article or such and such a study that says that like the vaccine is not like 100% safe. Okay, but then what we need to do then to like protect like all of our health and like nip this pandemic in the bud is we have to then go back to 6-month lockdown, and then as a leftist I would be advocating for universal basic income, suspending people's rents and mortgages, and just bail out the people and compensate everyone's businesses for the inconvenience. Don't let them don't let them go bankrupt and then give it to another bigger business. But that's not what these people were. That's not what these people were demanding. These people were basically like COVID minimalists and COVID denialists, and just like rah, we want our freedoms back, and just let the virus rip, and we'll develop herd immunity from it.
Well, it really revealed that anarcho-fascist strain that exists in certain areas of like the white left, and like there was a lot of like white anarchists that were into this. The same people that sort of thought that if you voted for Trump, this would somehow create enough of a state of chaos that would upend the state. And of course, that's not what happens. What happens
or the folks who voted for Brexit.
Yeah, you get authoritarian.
That kind of like left nationalist.
There's that class of people that thinks that what we want is maximum chaos, and then that will break things open, and then you can kind of redo things. But as we know, it leads to authoritarianism. We saw that in the convoy. So obviously I am not pro-convoy. Obviously I am also concerned with the Emergency Act and the invocation of that, and things like freezing people's finances, because we know what's coming next. Like, you donate to Palestine, they're going to freeze that. You donate to environmental organizations. So it sets terrible precedents. And we know that those precedents, they never really have the will to use them on like white conservatives. Like the white conservatives in government support this. And of course, we saw this ridiculous, the National Post, I think New York Times, their reporting was terrible. We got like the National Post being like, never has this been seen in policing Canada. It's like the most gentle arrest. And again, don't support police arresting people, like whether or not I agree with them politically. I obviously don't support these kind of police actions. But, you know, nobody was kneeling on your neck. You weren't getting the shit kicked out of you, right? That like people got defending homeless encampments. It's like just somebody lying as on the ground as they get arrested. They're like, this is disgusting. You're like, you know, did you miss like what happens to people all the time? So, you know, there's this particular, as I said, like, which is about white freedom. The idea that, and this is the same thing about policing, that as long as policing is solely directed towards Black people, Indigenous people, sex workers, trans people, queer people, people who use drugs, people with mental illness, everyone's fine with it and calls for more of it. And then the minute white people, white, conservative, you know, middle-class men, you know, the minute any policing is directed towards them, then it's an injustice. You see the same thing. So we recently did a report for the police board, like it was commissioned by the police board here, defining defunding the police. So it's called Defunding the Police, Defining a Way Forward for HRM, which is like a 219-page report that more or less lays out the pathways through which one could defund the police in our specific municipality, but it relates to other areas as well. And like one of the things we recommend is like traffic cameras, you know, like red light cameras. It removes police from obviously police stops, which is where a lot of racial stops are. And of course, we recommend the data not be held by police so that they can't access the racially profile. It needs to be held by like transportation. But if you remove the data from the police and have these cameras, it's a very neutral way of policing traffic. You don't need to hire more officers and it removes the racial element. Well, white people, this has been a bugbear of the conservative right for like ever. Because, of course, now it equitably distributes policing. If you run a red light, you don't get to negotiate with your bro fellow cop. You just get the ticket. And so they're outraged by this. But they're fine with racial profiling. So the minute you actually suggest to them that they face policing, it's an injustice to them. But, of course, they advocate more police in our communities. Why aren't they arresting those people? So you saw that with the convoy. So, like, I'm leaving aside, obviously, I'm not going to debate, you know, issues of the vaccine and COVID. That's not, you know, like I'm not getting into that. Like the point here is why this particular group of people of a particular political leaning, of a particular racial composition, were able to occupy a city and the police were hands off. And then when they did finally, you know, were forced, which I think it was the police forcing a crisis. So my point to the like anarchist leftists is that's what the police always want. They want a state of crisis and it always leads to more authoritarian measures. It does not lead us you know, to that place. But then, of course, also, like, I mean, there's always, it just reveals a lot of the white solidarities in the left. And, you know, like, that's difficult, you know, organize with people when you're like, but you, like, this isn't just people calling people Nazis and you mean someone has a different point of view. Like, these were, like, really, like, it was really, we know the majority of the money came from far-right groups in the States. We know who donated. That information is all public. We know the organizers of the convoy were former cops and soldiers, like military, like state people. This is not some anarchist like event that was being organized. This was obvious from the beginning. And it's quite frightening that a lot of people that, and like, you know, I would have, you know, think of as like good, solid comrades on the left, as you say, were like suckered into supporting this under this guise that this was populist or worker-led. And of course, it was not our conservative government. I'm no supporter of Justin Trudeau, but
neither am I. Yeah.
Conservatives certainly didn't get CERB, didn't get any of the, you know, so everybody in Canada, like we had CERB like $2,000 a month that people could apply for if you lost your job during COVID. We know that wasn't actually happening under a conservative government. They don't support those measures. So this idea that like the left didn't organize anything for workers and that's why people now have to be white supremacists, which is this ongoing like become a white supremacist to own the libs type dialogue that you often see in this another segment of the left, that everything is the problem of wokies and, you know, if we just stop caring about our identities, then so this idea that we cause all this by talking about our pronouns or whatever, you know, like this very shallow, like the anti-woke reading that is quite popular, where people end up never critiquing conservatives or the right wing and ultra critiquing, you know, the liberals. And I'm not a liberal, but
or the cultural Marxists.
All your criticism, like 100% of your criticism is just to own the Democrats or own the libs. And so then you're literally like supporting a white supremacist uprising and pretending it's a worker-led movement. And maybe if the left wasn't busy like talking about XYZ, which is always coded as like, if you stop talking, if Black people would just shut up and sit down, then the left could be rightfully led by white men. And why don't you guys just shut up and stop trying to talk about like land back or, you know, your land titles or police brutality. Like, why can't you just put those aside? So, none of this is new. Obviously, it's just revealed in public, like through the convoy.
And it's funny, like that wasn't a question I was planning on asking you, but let's get into this about, I remember, which is how do we try to overcome that toxic debate of identity politics versus the class struggle? Now we're both leftists. I know completely where some of those well-meaning leftists, the kind of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyns, and some of my friends, in the Communist Party or some Trotskyist party, I know exactly where they're coming from when they say that class is like the big issue which can unite all of us, blah 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 blah. Like, I understand all of that, but the problem, but the more and more I'm seeing, like, let's just call them what they are, the white Marxist leftists, the more I hear them, like, complain bitterly about, like, identity politics, it's becoming more and more of a dog whistle of, I don't want to talk about anti-black racism. I don't want to talk about, like, transphobia. I don't want to talk about, like, sexism. Come on, guys, we just need to talk about, the grievances of the working class, which is basically the white working class. and the moment we overcome that, that's going to kill all the other injustices, completely forgetting that, like, excuse me, black people, we suffer unique forms of discrimination. Queer people suffer unique forms of discrimination. Women of all colors suffer unique forms of discrimination. And then, don't even get me started on people who are on disability and our Indigenous brothers and sisters and elders. So, so your thoughts on that?
Obviously, like, bourgeois identity politics. Like, I have this poem, a woman's going to send the bombs, which is making fun of, like, Kamala Harris. So it starts, a woman's going to send the drones, like, so obviously there's a valid critique, which, by the way, like, white people who make this critique seem to forget that black people have been making this critique for decades. I mean, like, Chris Hani was making this critique of the ANC. Like, the idea that white people suddenly discovered that racial capitalism is a thing, you'll note that, so if you, like, watch these YouTubes or watch this discourse, they rarely cite black scholars. And, like, it's not like black organizers haven't known this for decades. And of course, Cornel West and others were criticizing this during Obama, right? Like, and talking about how Obama really lured a lot of the left black class, that we didn't have, like, an anti-war protest under Obama, so that's a long-term critique, and it's existed long before that. Like I said, Chris Hani was critiquing the ANC for this in, like, the 1960s, racial capitalism is well established as a line of critique, so this isn't new, and it's not something that, like, white people notice and black people are like, what? No. So, like, there's a legitimate critique, obviously, about how the elite uses identity in these spaces. And we see this, for example, like, even post-2020 in Canada, where the George Floyd uprising, which was about the war on drugs, it was about police brutality, it was about incarceration. So issues that largely impact, the more vulnerable, I don't like the word vulnerable, the more economically marginalized you are, obviously, the more likely you are to be murdered by the police. Like, yes, black people who are, professors or doctors aren't immune, but obviously less likely to face the sharpest wing of the state, right? And that in Canada has more or less been diverted into somehow something about black businesses. Like, all the funding that the government is getting is, like, black entrepreneurship. The people they're listening to are, like, black people that work on Bay Street. There's this awful initiative, like Black North Initiative. Desmond Cole and I wrote a number of pieces on this. You can find it on our site, yeseverything.ca. The Blackwash is what the series is called. And it's looking at how Black North Initiative specifically, like, so they created this pledge for corporations to sign against.
And actually, sorry to interrupt you because this was something I actually typed up. Is I did want you to talk about like, how is it that every time a George Floyd, a Rodney King, or one of these stories happens to a black person, Indigenous person, an immigrant, legal or otherwise, why is it that every time an act of, like, state terrorism happens on our people and other people, first comes, the big protests, then comes like the really big like uprisings and so forth. But then it gets switched from, wow, we really need to sort this this police abuse of power to, what needs to happen. We need to have more black businesses, and black businesses need to flourish and stuff like that. And the moment all of y'all become like middle class or affluent, guess what? The police won't murder you.
And you saw this happening right away, right? So the specificity of what we were talking about, police violence, then became racism, which is fine. But then, suddenly it became people talking about like how they can't get their hair cut or something, which then, and I'm not saying that's not an issue, but it's not the same issue as like, being murdered by the police, which then became black businesses. And now this is where we are, that, like they recently held a budget consultation. I wasn't there, I wasn't invited, but like a consultation on the budget by the Parliamentary Black Caucus, and the only people they invited to speak were all business people and entrepreneurship people. So so like to say that there's a very legitimate critique. So the Black North Pledge was like getting all these Fortune 500 companies to sign on to a pledge against anti-Black racism, and it's all like mining companies that are murdering people in Ghana, like oil companies and like the most anti-Black companies in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like literally Enbridge, it's like, criminalizing Indigenous people, like, so that is rightfully critiqued. And we know that the Black elite consistently, as you said, will come upon these issues, use their presence in the Hall of Powers to divert this into like budgets and grants for their friends. And the Black working classes, the Black people living in shelters, the Black unhoused, the Black people in prison remain uncared for, unspoken about, as long as, these rich people get their few millions to pass out to their friends. So that is a completely legitimate critique. And as I said, this is not a new critique. Like Rocky Jones, I have the book sitting right here, so I'll hold it up. So this is the great organizer in Nova Scotia, Burnley Rocky Jones, revolutionary. So Rocky Jones is known as like Canada's Stokely Carmichael, which is dumb. But
how come?
It's like, I don't know why we have to like always attach things to other countries. But he was like a great organizer in Nova Scotia. And like if you read his book, he's talking about these critiques. Like they're talking about forming a political party in like the 60s and having it infiltrated by bourgeois Blacks who quickly sold them out to the government and then like got grants. So this is not new. So there is that critique. But that is different from the recognition, as you said, that Black people will always experience the sharp end of state violence, that we cannot talk about borders and status and labor without talking about Black migrant workers who are the most policed and the most deported. In fact, in Canada, we don't even know that because we don't keep numbers on it. So we literally just bury Black migrant people in jails, and like, unless you do this work, you just like, there's no official numbers. We don't know how many people die in immigration detention in Canada. Like we don't have a straight list of names. So that's the pretense that you can somehow deal with class issues without understanding that the capitalist system is underlaid by Black people as property is, complete ahistorical misreading. How do you think this capitalist, this Eric Williams was telling us this in like 1930, like, what is it, 1936? Like Capitalism and Slavery, and it's just been republished in the UK after 80 years, speaking of cancel culture, right? Like this book that was like entirely wiped out. Eric Williams is telling us this, the co-development of racism and slavery. Many people have worked on plantation economies and how that continues to underlie the modern capitalist system, from banking to like how a university functions. So how do you think about capitalism, workers, consumerism, globalism without understanding like the Black underclass and Black labor that has always underlaid that? So you cannot remove that from the left. So even issues that they think are silly, like cultural appropriation, and that's so silly, but that is actually about property, right? That's about property rights, and it goes back to a capitalist analysis. So, so there's the legitimate critique, like I said, not coming from white people originally, of how bourgeois class issues work within the Black community, which we've all been critiquing. And then there's like this very shallow critique that it's, wokest to like talk about Black people being shot by the police, and why do we have to focus on race? And if we were just shut up about race, we could like unify the workers, Yeah. In fact, of course, many of these worker movements are being led by Black people for a reason. The Amazon strikes are being led by Black workers, and as if they don't connect their experience. The reason why Black people are leading anti-prison movements is because Black people have always had the historical understanding of the relationship of slavery and captivity and colonialism, imperialism that underlies the prison system, right? Like that reading has always been part of it. That's why the word abolition exists. It's deliberately chosen to connect it to the anti-slavery movement. So this idea that we can exit race through our analysis, and then, as you said, the idea of class is always coded neutrally, so-called, as white. In fact, of course, that's also this idea that now,
and
like
male too, because they don't want to talk about sexism
workers and minors, like as if they exist. When I'm like, the working class now is retail workers, you know. So it's also the constitution of the working. We see this like when they'll try and pull out like a miner or something, or you know, like a steel worker, a factory worker, you know, like Scranton Joe, and he'll go to like the factories, which we know is actually not like that's dying in North America. Those have been exported, and the working class now is like a retail worker, somebody driving your food for Uber that's on contract that doesn't even have like benefits or pension, you know. So even the way that the working class is imagined, you know, cops get to be considered working class still, like salt of the earth Irish working class cops, and they make like they're all on the sunshine list, as we call it, you know, like municipal workers that make over $100,000 a year, like, and would still, you know, say that cops are working class heroes, you know. So I mean, it's not even what the modern working class looks like, you know, so that you can uphold this vision of like the white working class. And this to take us back to the convoy, the majority of truckers obviously did not support this. More like, don't call this truckers. Like, we're actually working. Like 90% of us are vaccinated. And of course, the issues within truckers are actually South Asian truckers that are experiencing like a ton of discrimination within the trucking industry. So you had white people that weren't even truckers using the image of a trucker to play on this like white working class, you know, the hardworking trucker who's just driving your food on the shelf, who's white and just trying to support his family from the oil fields, when in fact the face of trucking in Canada is like South Asian people who, you know, aren't even being mentioned in all of this. So yeah.
But then, but then a quick follow up on that before we talk about Black Lives Matter is, you know, but then the $1 million question is you have a conversation with one of these white socialist, white Marxist, whatever they want to label themselves. And you talk to them, okay, how are we going to, you know, liberate our people and end this ghastly system of capitalism and stuff like that? And they start to say, well, and they start to explain to you why we should be talking about class, how it has to always be about class. How do you then push back against them and say, no, this is how we kill 2 to 5 injustices with one stone gun?
How is this new? Du Bois, you know, said the race line was a problem in the 20th century and then added in race and class. Like, we're talking about work from like 1900, you know, like this just isn't. And of course, the problem of Marx, like Marx, obviously we're all indebted to Marx, but like, you know, many white leftists are still wedded to this idea that like the revolution is going to come from, you know, the white North. When in fact, of course, there's so many movements in the global South that are completely ignored. You know, we've consistently seen, you know, we had movements, you know, millions of people marching through Santiago, you know, millions of people in Haiti. You know, Haiti has a massive worker strike right now. Like, people are walking out of the factories. They couldn't even afford posters, you know, and they're waving branches with leaves on them. And they're having a mass worker strike in the garment factories to, you know, put the wage up. And you don't see that in our papers anywhere. So, you know, there's also this very racist belief that like the movers and shakers of like the global worker revolution will be white workers in the West, and no understanding that it's, you know, Black, Latino and Latina, you know, like workers across the global South have created all kinds of movements in India, everywhere, right? So that's part of the problem, that they're talking about worker unity, but they're not even in international solidarity with any of these movements in other countries, or even understanding or talking about that. So it's part of this. And I mean, the left is terrible right now on anti-war, right? I mean, we're seeing this with Ukraine and Russia. So like, you know, that kind of international solidarity is like a big problem on the left anyway. And then when you're not aware of what people in Bolivia are saying, what people in Chile are saying, what people in Haiti are saying, because instinctually, yeah, and that, I mean, that was Marx, right? They really believed that Europe was going to be the heart of all of this, and they weren't interested in or knowledgeable about Like,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. He thought it was going to be England. He thought he thought the Russian Revolution was going to be the British Revolution.
And how do you live through like liberation movements that were happening with Black people and like not notice, which is like, every European philosopher talking about freedom and not noticing that Haiti's like up in flames or whatever, which Michel de Triot talks about in Silencing the Past, right? Like that very great book about the Haitian Revolution, how it could not exist to the European mind because like they simply cannot comprehend of the idea that Black people are capable of and understand and have agency towards freedom. And that is very embedded within the left. So everything that Black people talk about is by nature a distraction and identity politics and not about true freedom, which can only come, and this is Hegel, right? Hegel says in the philosophy of history, Hegel says Africa has no history, let us pass over it, right? So he says the nature of the East is barbaric, Africa has no history, and then of course is the idea of like, through like the West Europe, understands freedom, and that will like, this whole reading, and that idea has stuck around. Like that is a very inherent idea under white supremacy, that Black people are not capable of liberating ourselves, and we don't understand freedom. And as I said, so you have all these white Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau, everybody talking about freedom, man is born in chains, and like there's literal people in chains that they're not mentioning. Like, and then using the metaphor of slavery, they're obviously aware of it. And, many people who have talked about how did the Enlightenment philosophers, like, what did they know about race? People have talked about Kant and the fact that Kant was around abolitionists, but, wasn't mentioning it in universalism. And these are supposed to be the greatest thinkers of their age, and they, like, didn't notice slavery. Like, so
well, many of them also harbored racist views. Kant apparently was like a sexist and racist on top of that, and but then is like, the way forward for young people who are getting into activism, and these are people who do know how to chew gum and walk at the same time, like the Black Panthers before them, or like the American Indian movement, or and some of the people in the queer liberation movement and the anti-sexist movement. Like, what advice, what advice would you give to them when they run into that kind of like awkward brick conversation where such and such a white Marxist is like saying, I'm tired of people talking about like identity politics and stuff like that, and I'm tired of wokeism. Like, what advice, does a person just have to kind of like, it goes in one ear out the other and continue to do like the activism and consciousness and working every day to smash white supremacy and all the other evils, and just kind of like ignore the
well, I mean, I realize I'm sitting here talking to you now, but I'm not like that interested in any kind of organizing that's all talk or all scholarship. Like the answer is we have to be engaged in grassroots activism. When we're engaged with that, by nature, we're going to be engaged in the most intense lived state violence. Like, you just can't avoid it. So if you work on deportation, if you work with migrant workers, if you work with people who are incarcerated, like, you're just going to have to understand these things. So I'm not that interested in like theorizing on Twitter, or like that's just not, I don't have Twitter for a reason. Like, that's not, I think it's not to sound like old, but I think that, politics done on Twitter is like the death of like nuanced activist thinking, so these kind of, and that's what I mean. So then unless people get very caught up in like dunking on the Democrats or dunking on the liberals. And I think the politics of hypocrisy are nihilistic politics that don't take us anywhere. So like, when you're younger, obviously it's part of your awakening, right? When you understand things like white people can do this and I can't as a Black person. Like, you understand as a man, men can do things, but I'm a woman, like it's part of how you, but if you just get stuck in the space where all you can endlessly do is point out people's hypocrisies and inconsistencies. I was saying this with the convoy too, like we can't just be like, white people get to protest and Black people don't. And what does that mean? Like, what does that tell us about something? Like, so I think people get very caught up into this space where you just sort of endlessly point at how people have fallen short, or how this person's a hypocrite, or the politics of trying to expose this person, which is like YouTube politics. Like, so-and-so dunks on so-and-so, so-and-so claps back. Like, it's a very sort of shallow scoring points narrative that then, so, okay, government's hypocritical, and like, yes, liberals are hypocritical. Yes, they are. Like, they're inconsistent. They will profess one thing and do it like, okay, and right. So it doesn't really take you anywhere after a certain point. So at some point, you're going to have to get off that and organize. And I think there's too many people that are very stuck into this space of discoursing all day and that aren't actually, trying to organize. We have so much to organize. Many people have been organizing in unhoused encampments. Many people have been, organizing with prisoners, alongside prisoners, organizing alongside migrant workers. And so one of the things that is frustrating is when people go, well, the left hasn't done anything, and that's why, the convoy exists. I'm like, because the right wing is out here organizing migrant workers, right? So somehow that all isn't seen as like legitimate work. So I'm not, like, what I would say to a young person is get off Twitter, like go and actually organize and don't stress too much. Like, you have to do your reading to understand like the histories of what you're doing. You can't organize out of context, but the sort of just like hashtag this, hashtag that, I'm more communist than you, like, these kind of politics aren't very helpful. So I'm not that invested in them, to be honest. Like, I'm critiquing them with you, but, and I obviously, as a Black person, very heavily critique like the bourgeois politics of what I see happening, with the exactly like how post 2020, all of these initiatives have managed to be directed, no surprise, towards the Black elite. Like, I'm very critical of that because it impacts my community and I have to intervene in that. But I don't, if someone's like, I would just be like, okay, like, go organize and shut up, like, you'll never be short of work if you're trying to actually, you can pick one issue and do nothing but like one policy piece on it and organize your entire life,
Well, Ms. Jones, it's funny that you mentioned that because last week was International Women's Day, and the funny thing is every time I hear a discussion about feminism and smashing the patriarchy, the issue is never institutional sexism. The issue is always the feminists haven't done this. The feminists have not been communicators in doing this. The feminists are focusing too much on social feminism and not enough on class feminism. And the Western and then I think to myself, whoa. Time out for a moment. And then like I would, say to somebody, first of all, it's not true. I would give them a copy of Susan Faluti's book, Backlash, because that book goes to show you that with every fragile gain that like women's liberation has accomplished, like, the right to vote or the right to work outside of like, the house and stuff like that, it's always been met with a brutal, backlash and male supremacy even more strengthened. And it would be nice if like if I could hear a conversation about some of the accomplishments that feminists are doing, or at least give them a little bit of credit when they are protesting against the latest Christian fundamentalist that's passing an anti-abortion thing. But all I hear is people shitting on feminists and women shitting on feminism and taking feminism for granted. So and I say that because it's interesting what you were saying about how so much of the YouTube left and people, and it is too much on the discourse, and this one's a sellout, that one's a sellout, this one is this one's not anti-war enough, this one's not left enough, and
and I mean, like, what do you expect from politicians? So why are you so invested in the electoral system? So like, why don't you do something outside that system since you're on here? I don't know. It doesn't. And I'm not, again, like, critique is important, debate is important. And like, as many have observed, like, that is a problem, right? That we're less and less able to have robust disagreement without it like being, you're being violent or whatever, and like, we very much have to be able to debate strategy and tactic. We have to be able to take issues one by one and not be sort of handed a suite of ideas that we have to accept, like, it's very important to come to our own critical conclusions. Like, critical debate is key. And with the people I organize with, we discuss all the time, and we're comfortable discussing with each other. We get into disputes, and that's necessary. And obviously that has to happen. Like, the idea of some kind of orthodoxy, not even on the left, but even like within your organizing group, like, you can't have, we have to believe this, we have to do this. Like, we have to be able to discuss that. So critique is really important. I'm not saying that people should shut up and not critique, but I'm saying that critique has to be, there's a difference between like nihilistic critique and productive critique, right?
Yeah,
and I
exactly.
think that a lot of people are just nihilists. Like, say with like defunding, like, when people are like, well, like, I mean, if you're going to call for the police to be defunded 100, like, so, you know, some people call for police to be funded 50%. I'm like, but why 50? Like, why not 100? Why not 75? How do you come up with this number? You just made up a number because you don't actually believe that we can defund the police at all. So now it just becomes a kind of public contest on who's taking the purest position, rather than actually being like, how do we, through policy, how do we, through organizing, these very difficult paths. So like when we were writing this report, and I'm not saying it's like the be all and end all of like, you know, documents on defunding. There's many, many documents that all together, you know, but the thing that we were trying to contribute was a really specific, realistic policy pathway to sort of remove the idea that this was just fantasy and, you know, this is just something that left-wing people say. We were like, no, actually, here's 36 recommendations that you can do, you know, right now. So, and that was difficult. And when we were writing it, we're like, it's one thing to say, take the money from police to give it to housing. It's another thing to actually come up with the mechanism that your governance is going to have to use, right? Vancouver actually, the council voted against an increase to the police, and the police appealed it to like the provincial ombudsman and got the money back. So these are the kind of obstacles that you have to be ready to think about. So then how do you take over your police board? How do you, you know, what kind of engagements do you have with council? And this is long, slow, painful organizing. I mean, I told somebody, if I ever do something like this again, like stop me, because, you know, not only do we do the report, but now you have to go and like talk to this counselor, but you have to get people on board to get like each small chip of policy. And it's not necessarily what I love doing with my life, like sitting around for 4 hours with, you know, some provincial roundtable on policy or something. But, you know, you have to try and push these. So it takes what I'm saying is like, you have to work in all these different ways. And we have to strategize all of this and think about, like, you can't just be like, defund the police. I said it. I'm out. You know, like, it's like, then do you have your council in place? Do you have your board in place? Do you have the relationship between municipality and provincial, and how are you going to navigate that? And who do you have that's going to navigate that with you? And it's a lot of work and a ton of work to get maybe a little bit of the budget chipped away, which is what we got, like a little bit of a less of an increase. So then you had again, like all the purity people, we failed. And it's like, but we actually had a debate for the first time. It is actually a big step forward that for the first time, the police showed up. And normally what happens in budgeting is the police show up and they're like, we need this money. And everyone says, thank you, chief, here's your money. And like this year, for the first time, people were forced to ask questions. They were forced to return multiple times. It actually got sent back from council to the board, which has never happened before. And the chief was forced over and over again to justify, did he get the money? Yeah, more or less. But we had public questioning. And as that questioning happens, more and more people are like, wait a minute. But why can't he answer these questions? Why are they going behind closed doors for 2 hours? Like, it reveals the system to people, which then can help people organize and understand what we're organizing and like get behind, because this has to be collective, right? It can't just be one or two people screaming into the void. You need a huge mass of people. So, you know, just that's one example where we're like, you know, we're not celebrating, but this is a step forward. Like having that kind of questioning, having people on the board ask very serious questions, people noting the lack of evidence, making those comparisons, all of that is moving us hopefully towards a space where we are trying to shift the institutional reliance on policing, that unquestioning the chief must be right. And that's the step that we got to this year. Like, is there much further to go? Of course, but it doesn't really help when you go on Twitter and you're like, this is all a big failure. We did this report 2 months ago and it hasn't been fully implemented, so let's all give up and go home. It's like, you know, the battle against slavery was hundreds of years. Like, we're trying to shift a social institution that has embedded itself not just into every institution in our society, but into our hearts and minds, as people like Marion Kaba talk about. And it's not just the police, it's an ideological will to punishment, our will to call the police, a stigma towards other people, like why we want unhoused people policed. And all of that has to be shifted like rock by rock by rock by rock to get to a place where we might possibly see a social change. So all that to just say, like, you know, this were, apartheid, how long did, you know, it's like 50 years to shift apart. Like, you know, when you watch, if you've ever seen the documentary of Manland, they're like, you know, we were saying free in 63, right? Like, like, you know, like. That's a
perfect segue then to this question then, which is, how do you assess Black Lives Matter in Canada? Because there's a branch in Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton, Waterloo, Vancouver, Sudbury, Newfoundland, and Fredericton. How do you assess their efforts in addressing the Jim Crow Black Canadians face? What are your criticisms of Black Lives Matter, if you do have any, and
So we're going there. So I'm sure you're familiar with what has been revealed about the finances from Black Lives Matter Global Network, the critiques of Patrisse Cullors, for example, made by the families.
And I'll just say, as somebody who subscribes to Black Agenda reports, I have big issues with Alicia Garza and a lot of the Black Lives Matter.
And they were talking about this years ago, like when they were meeting with Hillary Clinton and being like, "What is white privilege?" instead of like talking about policy. So first of all, there's a difference between the Black Lives Matter movement as lived out in the movement and lives of Black people and the bourgeois institutionalization of BLM as led by a media selected group of people. So this goes back to the same critique when I was saying that Black people have been making these critiques, right? That we the Ferguson uprising by working class people in Ferguson, where right away you have like professional organizers like parachuting in and then being paid $40,000, $50,000 to go train people at Yale for a weekend while the organizers in Ferguson are murdered, right? But that doesn't legitimize the actual thing that Black people are fighting about, which is policing and state violence. This is the example of a movement either co-opted. Adolph Reed would argue that it was never a legitimate movement. I think in Canada there was a moment. I mean, it's different. Like I got into it with Adolph Reed in his like blog or whatever. He got into it with me a bit because but the Breach had just republished something like, and it was transcribed from an oral thing. So it's not, when you're writing, you're more specific. Like, it's like when I'm talking to you and then they transcribe it and it was about the co-optation of Black Lives Matter. He's like, how can you co-opt something that was always corrupt kind of thing? And I'm like, wait, but we're talking about Canada, and BLM Toronto was a big force. It really did, the Pride Parade and the stopping of that parade. And they were the people to sort of stop the parade. And this pushed the idea of the police out of Pride, not only in our city, but, in other cities as well. And
sorry to interrupt, but just in case people don't know, so Black Lives Matter. So there was going to be a queer pride parade. Black Lives Matter interrupted the parade, demanding that the police.
Yeah, they were actually asked to be the marshals of the parade, and then they stopped the parade that they were leading to read out demands that weren't just about Black people. They were about many groups, and included getting the police out of Pride. And then this is treated like interloping and interrupting, but in fact, they were the marshals. Like they were invited to be there. That's actually quite important as a piece. But like as in many countries, like because BLM starts as a very generational thing, right? Like against this kind of exactly the civil rights generation that has gone off and become members of like the Black Congressional Caucus and is now, signing to get military surplus sent into Ferguson, right? And BLM is young people that are like, we don't want to hear the preacher tell us to be calm. We don't care that you marched with King 50 years ago and now you're telling us to like, so there was a big generational thing, and that movement is real, right? And that also was taking place in Toronto with people like Yusra Kogali that, like a young Muslim, like 20-year-old Muslim woman getting up and saying things like Justin Trudeau is a white supremacist terrorist, which everybody got furious about. And then the convoy says it. And it's like legit, I'm like, well, you were mad when Yusra told you. It's like, anyway.
And the people at the convoy, they get to wear shirts with the F-bomb in it.
Yeah, they can say fuck, F Trudeau. But when Yusra said Trudeau's a white supremacist terrorist, the media said that she should be removed. But, she left BLM Toronto quite a few years ago now and said that there had been a shift and that they were what she described them as a neoliberal fire fest of organizing. So I was identifying these kind of cracks that often happen in movements that start as grassroots, start, from the people, and then get institutionalized in particular ways with the particular pressures of celebrity organizing, with the, pressures of state co-optation, with the pressures of becoming removed from community. It becomes, as your life moves on, it becomes more and more difficult to stay connected in certain ways. You move out of the neighborhood you lived in, and now you don't live in the same neighborhood and you're not organizing in the same ways. These are things that happen in every movement. So she was identifying that and left. I say that history to say that this has been a bit controversial in Canada because, and it's hard to get into the ins and outs because then they like constitute themselves as Black Lives Matter Canada, even though it's all the same people from Black Lives Matter Toronto, but they pretend they're not Black Lives Matter Toronto. So they'll get mad at you if you call them BLMTO, but it's all the same people. But they ended up buying a mansion for like $8 million with money from the BLM Global Network, the same money that like families in the States are saying, like, we need this money for like our well-being. So they more or less laundered it through Canada to buy a mansion that they're saying is like an art space, but obviously it's downtown Toronto. Obviously, if you don't live in Toronto, you're not going to have any access to this space. And there's been quite a bit of, I would say, like gaslighting around this, a refusal to engage legit, like, you know, so obviously a lot of us are critiquing this and saying that, first of all, like, what was your right to that money? You know, and second of all, is this a priority of the movement? And they start doing this Black Spaces Matter thing. I'm like, sure, but who said the space has to be a mansion? And then it's, we're entitled to nice things. So like this, and then a refusal to, in fact, confront any of this criticism or engage in it, right? So this idea that there's criticisms to be made, but there's never any place you can make them. So let's say we take criticism, but not from you, not from you, not from you, even though all of us organized with BLM together, even though many of us were obviously pre-organizing before BLM came on the scene. And so I don't want to like single people out as such. Like, this isn't me like I don't want to sit here and like go, this person, like they're trash. Like that's not helpful. I think what's more helpful is to recognize, as say, I keep going back to Chris Hani, but I find him very helpful. That piece that, you know, Hani writes in like the 60s, where he's talking about the ANC in exile and being like, you know, we're actually here on the ground fighting this war, like risking our lives. And you're sitting in London, you know, up in rich people's homes, like using your status as an exile to basically like live in luxury while your people, and they try to execute him for like saying this. So I'm saying that this is not new. This is not new. It is inevitable in most movements. Movements have a very short lifespan. And part of the problem is that people try to hang on to. I've done this in my own life, right? You start something and it's coming to its end, but you feel like I've invested so much energy into this, and it's hard to let go. It's hard to let somebody else run with it or say has played itself out. You have to almost have faith in yourself as an organizer and your like capacity as an organizer to say, time to let this thing go. Let's do the next thing. Let's move through that. And it's hard. So, and then you have white media that, you know, crowns people as leaders, and it's hard to leave being on the, you know, 30 under 30 list, or, you know, who are the most important people in Canada. That stuff's very seductive. And, you know, the money and, you know, like I understand it. I'm saying I think it's not unhuman, but we have to guard against it. And it's happened in every movement. I held up Rocky's book, and there's a really important section in that book where he talks about the organizing of the Black United Front and how that was immediately co-opted. And so that's been very instructive for me, like in my life, because I knew Rocky. And so I've known this story. So I've had this historical base coming from this province, and I continue to work with people who work to the Rocky, you know, elders that, you know, know this mechanism and speak to you about it. And it's not like I don't work in a university either. Like I have an elite job as well. And it's difficult to guard ourselves against the seductions of this table opens up to you, the title opens up to you, I could make a bank consulting if I wanted to, especially I just did this report and I didn't take money for it. And a lot of people were critical of that. Like you're saying that Black people work for free, right? They're like, you did that this report is like $300,000 worth of consulting and you guys just did it without taking money. Why? And I said, because I wanted to walk away, because I don't want a police board to own me, because I don't want them to have the ability to then, you know, co-opt me into their work. And as happened, I was very critical of the police online throughout this, and they kept trying to get me like fired. And I'm like, go ahead, I'm not getting paid. So go and find someone else who will do this for you for free. And it was very tactical, but a lot of Black people were like, so you're saying that we should do this work, like we're not worth a salary or something. I'm like, no, in this case, this is police governance is not police, but like we need to be, I don't want to have money coming to me from this that then I'm dependent on, that's now part of paying my rent, and then now I can't leave, right? So we have to make these tactical decisions, but I'm now getting all kinds of consulting offers, right? Because I did this report. So now municipalities are coming, and I could, if I wanted to, I could probably leave my academic job and make bank, like way more money consulting, but consulting for what? Businesses, consulting for government, consulting for cops, right? So we have to be really careful, and it's really difficult. And that is what we've seen happening, but it hasn't been able to be the kind of critical, full-fledged calling and discussion that we need to have. There's been a lot of stonewalling about it, a lot of gaslighting around it. Like if you're saying something, you're a counter-organizer. I don't know if you saw the statement by two younger organizers, Sarah Jama and Sarah, who
I believe so on Twitter. Yeah.
So they came out and more or less said that they had been trying internally to have these conversations. It turned out that BLM Canada had taken money from Amazon at the same time as they're suppressing strikes, and from Coca-Cola. Like they were taking corporate donations and not revealing it to the public. So they weren't even coming to the Black community and saying, what do you think? They were taking this, burying it, ton of like complete unaccountability and no transparency around, like many of these people are involved in the global network themselves, which they don't admit to and don't talk about. But, like Jay is from BLMTO. That is Patrice Cullors' spouse. And Sandy Hudson is Jay's cousin. Like, these are very tight relationships, which I understand is difficult to negotiate. So I'm not trying to be personally critical here. I'm just saying that, part of what's happened here is there's a very strong relationship to the global network, and we're not able to talk about this and talk about where this goes wrong and like what kind of guidance can we have as a community. And I'm not saying I probably haven't made these mistakes too. Like, we all make missteps. We all have to fight our desire for these things. But that's why we need people around us to pull us back and say, are you sure this report is the thing you want to do? Are you sure you should go to that meeting? Be careful, because you may not understand this, but other people are now seeing you this way, right? Like, you really need to come back to community, and that hasn't happened. So it's been quite controversial. They recently released a quite awful report for the Wild Sea Center, which is this mansion, and it's quite untruthful about a lot of things. So I guess I shouldn't be saying all this on YouTube, but whatever. And again, like, these are people that I've worked with and I'm affectionate for, and we've supported each other. And it's not personal when I'm making this critique. I'm not saying they're trash people. I'm not saying they haven't got out and bled in these streets. They have. But that doesn't mean that, therefore, everything you do for the rest of your life is immune from communal criticism, just as I'm not immune from communal criticism as well. I might get some for this. So,
Well, I just want to, I just want to say any one of a representative of Black Lives Matter Toronto, if they want, I always put my email and stuff. They can always like contact me to whatever the hell. But
I also on the other hand, I'm very much pushing back on the discourse where people then want to be like, see, they was always trash or whatever. And I'm like, no, because there's obviously a lot of homophobia and transphobia. Like, oh, well, they're all gay anyway, like you get a lot of that with BLM, right? Because it's queer Black people. And I obviously, we have to really reject that. I reject, when Adolph Reed is kind of like, well, they was always trash. I mean, I don't know, maybe yours was, but BLM Toronto was very important. You have to give them their props, what they accomplished between like 2015 and 2018. And I mean, a lot of the gross stuff we're experiencing now is specifically engineered as a backlash to the success of BLMTO. Right? Like, when government started putting in like anti-Black racism stuff and stocking it with like bourgeois lawyers, like when they started appointing judges as head of advocacy, when we have all these business people, that is actually a government reaction to the effectiveness of street organizing. So I will never allow people to say that, BLM Toronto in its like heyday did not shift the needle in Canada, was not an extremely important movement, didn't teach us a lot. But I just don't agree with the
you just completely reject the idea that they were always gaslighters and I don't know pseudo leftists.
I'm happy to hear from people that worked with them. Maybe they were, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of critiques of like that original core bill and how they expropriated everything from Ferguson. So I'm not talking about them. I'm saying BLMTO, who I know more closely and worked with more closely. I believe that they were doing effective and important work in Toronto and in Canada, particularly between 2015 and 2018. I disagree with the direction in 2022. I would say this to their faces. That doesn't mean I don't have love for them. It doesn't mean that we haven't shared moments of comradeship, but I just think this, and it's, as I said, I understand it. I understand the lure of money. I understand the lure of celebrity. I understand all these things. I am not immune to them myself. So I would be a hypocrite to act like I'm, pure and I have never taken a misstep or made a wrong tactical decision or done something because of ego or whatever it is. Like, we have all done that. But the problem with these movements, and it's partly because of this like celebritization, right? People are appointed as leaders. They're appointed, and then there's a lot of pressure. You take a lot of illegitimate criticism as well. I understand all of that, but this is why we have to build community around us. And this is why organizing has to be collective and from the grassroots up. And if we're no longer part of the grassroots, then we need to remove ourselves from calling ourselves organizers, and that's fine too. It's okay to say, I did my bit, I used my capacity, now I'm going to write books. That's fine, but just don't continue to say that you're leading a movement, Right?
And that's a perfect segue to this question. I want to get back into some of the issues of of policing and abolitionism. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask you this, which is, with all the calls to defund the police, and Canada is a much more radical. I hear it's much more radical because you guys do want to abolish the police. It's not just defund the police. You guys want to defund it to abolish the police. And I'm still quite, and I'll be honest with you, I'm still quite agnostic about that. There's still a part of me that thinks that the police are a necessary evil. But one thing I am for sure not agnostic about, that I'm 100% want to abolish it. I would like to abolish, the Canada's Secret Service. I would love to abolish the CIA, the deep state, the Canadian military, Five Eyes Alliance, NATO, NORAD, AFRICOM, and so forth. So I have to ask: are there any talks in these Black and Indigenous and broader leftist circles advocating for the abolishing of those institutions? Why or why not? And do you think it's long overdue that Black Canadians started their own organization like Black Alliance for Peace, where we want to stop white supremacy at home, but we also want to stop white supremacy, abroad?
Yeah, I mean, Bianca, who has been doing, great work organizing on this. So there is a growing reviving of the anti-war left in Canada. Halifax has actually, obviously, we're a port town, we're a military town, so we have a quite long history of anti-war organizing. It's traditionally not been Black organizing. Like, African Nova Scotians aren't super active in that because people have such intense, like, local issues, right? Like, people are fighting for their land. They were fighting, so it's not something that you'll see a ton of, like, Black people in. Now that we have more refugee immigrant populations, more of that, because they'll hold solidarity for Somalia, solidarity for South Sudan. So it's growing as we also get people that aren't African Nova Scotian in who come from that global context. And we need to do more organizing within, like, Black communities. So one of the challenges, and I'm sure it's the same in many countries, like, one of the challenges in Canada, and particularly perhaps intensified in Nova Scotia, because there's a historic. So when I say African Nova Scotians, I'm talking about a unique historic, like, nation of people. So this is the specific group of people that are descendants from, like, loyalists, maroons, refugees that have hundreds of year history. We're talking, generations of history in this province, which is the first settlements of, like, Black people in Canada.
So if I was to move to Canada, I should move to Nova Scotia then.
Well, it's also the site of the most intense white supremacy in Canada. So, as a result. So, but when you think of Canada, most people think of Montreal and Toronto, right? And as Black people, as sort of a lot of the imaginings of Black history in Canada that starts with, Caribbean immigration in the 60s, right? Or 50s in Montreal. When in fact, of course, hundreds of years before that, there's Black people living in Nova Scotia, building communities. So I say that to say that, like, there's, like, it's challenging because you have a historic working class population that has experienced extreme white supremacy. Like, we had segregated schools. They were buried in different sections of the graveyard here. Like, what you think of as the American South took place in Nova Scotia in Canada, which is surprising people. There was enslavement here, right? The first recorded race riots in North America are in Nova Scotia, in Birchtown. I think Washington Black, if you read that book, covers that. Speaking of Washington Black, currently there's actually a very important movement because that they're filming that here, but they totally excluded the local Black businesses and economies, like, not the film, the town. So there's actually a quite brilliant open letter that people should look at that's really talking about storytelling and reparations, right? That these stories are being extracted from African Nova Scotians in, like, Book of Negroes, Washington Black, like, these historic communities. And then they come and film, and the town gives all the business to, like, white Airbnbs, white caterers, and the Black people don't even get, like, any economics. So people are talking about, like, the reparations of storytelling, which I think is really interesting and important. They're like, we don't even have clean water in our community. Like, we can't even get a well to have unpoisoned water. And our stories are going around the world, right? So people so that's to show, like, the intense poverty, the intense oppression that, like, still exists here. So people aren't necessarily, like, if you're fighting for well in your community, you're not necessarily like, on what's happening in Haiti, like, solidarity. So I'm just saying that it's difficult with the different communities. We are often in silos and don't organize together, which is one of the problems of not having, like, an internationalist Black left in Nova Scotia. But more broadly, yeah, there hasn't, I mean, we know this across the country. Like, the left has completely abandoned anti-war platforms. You won't hear it in our elections. So yeah, we talk about defund the police. We don't talk as much about, like, defund the military, even though, obviously that's going up. Like we're spending, $70 billion or whatever it is on private.
It's the police and the surveillance state on steroids,
and it's just the external policing. So there needs to be more of that. Now Halifax does have a small but robust anti-war movement. As I said, it's not super black, but it's long-standing, like Voices of Women. And what we have every year is the International Security Forum. So do you know about this, the Halifax International Security Forum? I stopped looking at the camera. Eh? I got this new webcam, and I'm doing this thing for the breach, and they're always like, you have to sit up straight, you have to look at, we're doing an online web show, like me, Pam Palmater, Martin Lukash, like we actually start next week, hence the new background,
that's all good. It's all good.
And so he started looking away, and they're all like, sit up straight, look in the camera, don't swivel your chair, don't move, and I'm like, totally. Now we've been talking so long, I'm like just all over the place. But so the Halifax International Security Forum was begun by former Defense Minister Peter MacKay under Stephen Harper, under the guise that this would pay for itself in like 2 years. We're still paying for it as taxpayers. And they bring in every year, like all the G20, it's like NATO, all of this. So like the generals, it's
like an arms show. It's an arms show, an arms expose.
Well, and also like like the New World Order, if you want to put it that way, without the anti-Semitism, like it's like that. Like the thing that people's little anti-Semitic fantasy about Soros or whatever, it's like the actual thing that's actually happening. Like when governments and newspapers and universities and weapons all get together.
Soros is still a piece of shit, though. I just have to say that.
You know what I mean? Like, some people are like, oh, the Jewish world conspiracy. It's like, this is the actual world conspiracy. So that's in Halifax every year where they get together and plot war. They used to have their whole agenda online. I think they've removed it over the years because it was so transparent. Like in 2009, they were like, Syria, is it the path to Iran? Like they're literally like, how do we make war on China? They do this like out in the open. I actually got a press pass this year and went, and it's unhinged. They were talking about China and their pledge against China. Like how, it's just like, so that takes place in our city. And there's a protest every year, a small, as I said, but hearty protest. Unfortunately, we just lost Alan Besenson, who's a absolute stalwart of that movement. He just passed a couple of weeks ago. All to say that like we've had a decent, like that is here, like and we do have like pushing back on this particularly grotesque theater of like disgusting war plotting that happens in the middle of our city, almost like unaware to a lot of people. But I mean, we need more internationalism. Like the Pan-African movement has, faded in a lot of ways, right? You'd think with social media we'd be more open to the world, but it seems to become less, right? That was a really long answer to say, yes, we need an anti-war left. We actually had Baraka up here and Margaret Kimberley as well. So I actually brought them in.
Okay. It needs to happen. It needs to happen. If you start an organization, please do do hire me. I would gladly come move to Canada to start an organization like that. Especially if it was led by Black and and Indigenous people, which the solidarity that exists amongst your Black people and Indigenous people there is way better than in the United States. Which I won't get into how much that pisses me off, but it does get under my skin. But that said, Eve Engler was talking about how nowadays in Canada, like you can say Canada was founded on like genocide and stuff like that, but to say that like Canada's like foreign policy is for the benefits of corporations and military industrial complex, that still is not there. His book, I was very shocked at how Indigenous people, who you would think would be the most the most informed on Canada's real role in the world due to the ongoing settler-colonialism, but so much of them were co-opted that, oh no, Canada treats us bad at home, but they are a force for good in the world. Really? Yeah. And Eve gives like examples of this in his book, Left, Right, and then just the other day, I was looking at like all of the propaganda against Russia, like Hollywood's boycotting it, Universal Music is boycotting Russia, McDonald's and Burger King are getting out of Russia, and there was an Indigenous community that was like making all of these like flags, like like we stand with Ukraine, and I was like, what? And like that broke my heart because like I love Indigenous people, and it's like no guys, no.
The Ukraine thing, and I mean I don't want to get into, and that's a complicated issue, but you can stand with Ukraine without anyway.
without the flags that have all of like the Nazi symbols on it.
I mean, I don't mean to sound elitist and rude, but you see this all the time. Like, effective advocacy requires effective education. That doesn't have to be taking place in a formal level. It's self-education, but you have to understand things. Like, go and ask people the difference between the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Justice in Canada. People that work on these issues and can't tell you what is under which. So how do you advocate? People don't understand the different levels of government and how they're involved in policing. People don't understand the difference between police and police boards. I found out when people kept accusing me of working for the cops when I was doing this report. I'm like, you understand police boards of governance, right? Like, these basic things people don't necessarily, and this, I would suggest, not to sound again like fixated on Twitter like I'm 100 years older, like it's Twitter. But again, like, a lot of this discourse doesn't lend to the kinds of deep reading and research you need to do to effectively engage. So understanding foreign policy is not something you're just going to pick up. You can't just, you have to go and read things. You have to go and talk to people. You have to, it's complicated. And I think in many ways, it's perhaps more work than people are able to do or prepared to do, depending on their positioning, right? So I don't blame working class Black people just trying to put food on the table for not sitting down and reading a book about Haiti. But among the professional organizing class, if you want to put it that way, honestly, I think, and this is one of my kind of bugbears, I'm always going on about this, you have to do the reading, you have to understand the history, and you have to understand the history of Pan-Africanism, the history of Black involvement, Black sovereignty, it's not easy to pick these things up. You have to go out of your way to kind of make sure that you're keeping up on this, and I think that people don't have a lot of will for that. It's easier to, do a local issue than it is to educate yourself on something in a totally different country, right? And without mentorship and organizing, without young people being brought up by elders who are willing, walking you through this, where do you start, right? If you just say to a young person, you should be aware of international issues, unless they're in international development, in which case they're getting a twisted view through the university, right? That isn't necessarily helpful either. It's complicated. So I'm saying that the kind of knowledge curve is hard, I think, as well. And then it's difficult because, you don't feel I can speak confidently about things that are happening in Nova Scotia. I'm let's not touch Russia, Ukraine, because you're then you have to deal, it's a lot. So I think it's difficult for people to kind of, but I mean, one thing I will say that, so while the security forum is going on this year, there was a big protest for Wet'suwet'en at the same time, but this is where we need to get more coordinated, because had we sort of been more coordinated, we could have brought that Wet'suwet'en protest outside the Westin. There's only really one route out to the airport. So it would have been quite effective should people have happened to be on that street at the same time as people like the generals who plotted 9/11 happened to be going to the airport, I'm not suggesting that people would have blocked their path. I'm just saying, happened to be in the crosswalk, it might have been difficult for some of these warmongers to make their way out.
Of course, when you explain to people, something, like Ukraine, that all of those guys that you keep calling Russian separatists, that they're Ukrainian, they're just Ukrainians of a Russian background, and people still have a very hard time wrapping their heads what you mean, I'll just say, the following in order, I say this to all the Black, Canadians and the Indigenous ones, that it's complicated, but it's also not that complicated. What you're fighting against at home, white supremacy, racial capitalism, and environmentally destructive mining projects, you're fighting against that, overseas. And the governments don't always overthrow socialist reformist leaders like Aristide or Hugo Chavez. Sometimes they're just getting into mob wars with Putin, who's also a capitalist. But the fact of the matter is it's just is that you can't have justice at home. You can't say you're all about smashing white supremacy and stuff like that, and be de facto supporting it. Overseas. So that's my, sort of, two
totally.
cents.
But I mean, I was wishing, if we had done that Wet'suwet'en protest outside the Westin where they hold this conference, international media were there. So it's just we missed an opportunity to coordinate something that was local with something that was very global. We had journalists from around the world, we had military from around the world. We could have connected those issues. had we been more on the ball with it. And so we need to do that work is what I'm saying. When I say do the reading, I'm not saying people are dumb or something. I'm not saying it as like a critique of people's capacities. I'm saying it as a critique of like where we direct our organizing energies. And again, I think that's because there's a sort of easy path towards organizing, which is just get on Twitter, get on social media, get on your Instagram, get on TikTok, and look cool doing it. And then there's the really difficult paths, which are about the hard work of learning, seeking out mentors, attending things and listening, reading the books. And you don't have to go to university for that. But guys in prison do this. They are far more up on any of this stuff than like we are. They call you and they're, talking to you about, they'll have a whole analysis like that. So I'm saying you have to be like, middle class university educated. Like people in prison with grade 3 educations that are mad intelligent sit there and talk about these issues. But we need to encourage more of that, like learning circles, reading and stuff. What was always understood in every revolutionary movement. Like if you watch that documentary, it's narrated by Lauryn Hill, right? Where it shows, what's it called? Violence. You know what I'm talking about, and it's like footage.
I'm actually not familiar with this.
Cabral, and like there's like text from Fanon and stuff in there, and it's like got like people like it's like Cabral in like the jungles. It's called something violence. I can't remember the title. Lauryn Hill is the narrator, but anyway, it's like got this dope footage of everybody like in guerrilla war, but they're like sitting there reading, like they're in the middle of like a guerrilla war, and they're also like reading Mao and like reading Fanon and like reading these texts, because every revolutionary movement understood that you had to have that piece that put things together, that gave you a global perspective. Every Black nationalist movement became internationalist. Malcolm became an internationalist. The Panthers became internationalists. MLK became internationalist. Like, so we have to make that move, and it's a move that every local organizer who is of significance made in their lives, right? They started on intense local issues and they started making those connections. So we need to, on the left, like, yes, you stay local, like you have to work on those local issues, but then understand that like the land back movement is also an international movement. The movement for water is an international movement and against corporations, right? We have to understand the military and how that, Vandana Shiva does such a beautiful job of connecting that to the women's rights movement, to environmentalism, right? So abolition, like the abolition of prisons is connected to this, right? Prisons
and actually, and that's
the resources, right? So
that's a perfect segue. That's a perfect segue to to abolitionism, because now because you are an abolitionist, and as I said to you earlier, and I think even in our last conversation, I'm still agnostic when it comes to abolishing the police, but I do believe in ending the drug war. And not just decriminalizing, but legalizing all drugs. I can get to the specifics of how that would happen, but that's my position. I'm definitely for demilitarizing the police, definitely for ending private for-profit prisons and releasing, all nonviolent offenders and people who were coerced, into taking plea deals, which resulted in them going, to jail. But so try to convert me to abolitionism. Can you explain why, even if someone, consumed alcohol and whatever drugs and got into a car accident and killed a passenger or a pedestrian, why even that person, should be released from prison, when why prison is not the,
it's interesting that that's your example, because that's not usually the example people would use. Normally people would say like someone who killed a woman or something.
That's my other example. That's my other example. That and the pedophile that actually So
first of all, like, I don't think anybody's advocating the abolition of prisons wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be a place where, like the Paul Bernardos, Robert Pictons of the world would be kept away from us, because obviously, like, those people aren't safe to be in public. So I don't think anybody's advocating that, somebody who's a serial killer, somebody who's, a serial rapist, that we wouldn't need places for those people to be. They don't have to look like the way a prison is constructed. Like, do you need Paul Bernardo in a 6x6 cell with his head next to the toilet for him to be, kept away from society? Or is there a punitive element to that? Now, nobody's defending like Paul Bernardo here. That's not the point. Like, Paul Bernardo is grotesque. Nobody is defending him. But of course, what we perform upon Paul Bernardo today becomes a normal punishment for everybody else tomorrow. We've seen that steadily within punishment. So the problem with the punishment regime in general is that today's heavy punishment becomes tomorrow's normal punishment, becomes the future's light punishment, and then we have to re-up on punishment. So when Canada abolished the death penalty, we moved to life sentences. So we abolished the death penalty in, 72? Don't trust me on this. And we moved to life sentences. And the average life sentence used to be 7 to 10 years. We assumed that after that was a long time in prison. And after that, the person should be rehabilitated. And then, somebody got out on parole and there was a horrific murder. So there's a reaction. So sentence should be longer. So now the average life sentence is 15 to 18 years from 7 to 10. So if you can't rehabilitate somebody in 10 years, what is happening differently after 18 years? So punishment always, so one thing for prisoners' rights in general is it's difficult to speak about because, then people are like, oh, the dangerous offenders. But of course, stripping their rights today leads to the stripping of everyone's, including the woman who just stole baby formula's rights tomorrow. So that's why we have to think carefully about those rights, not because we're empathetic to a serial killer or a trafficker of Indigenous women and Black women, but because we will always start practicing something like dangerous offender designations in Canada used to just be for serial killers, and now 30% of them are Indigenous people, and none of them are serial killers. It's so we have a designation of dangerous offender because in Canada, unlike the States, our maximum sentence is supposed to be 25 years, right? And after that, you're supposed to, now it doesn't happen. I know guys serving 37 years because they just don't get parole, because 25 is just your first chance of parole. But in theory, the theory underlying the Canadian justice system is supposed to be that eventually everyone's getting out. So therefore, you should have rehabilitation. Unlike the States, where they just give people 300-year sentences, right? So we have a designation of dangerous offender that was put in because people were like, yeah, but what about serial killers and stuff? How do we keep them in? What if they go after 25 years? So we created this designation of indeterminate sentences, like dangerous offenders and people serving indeterminate sentences, to be able, initially for white guys that serial killed women, basically. Now we apply it, an Indigenous person could have one stabbing and then a second stabbing, and now we're declaring them a dangerous offender and they can't ever get out. And it doesn't matter what rehabilitative programs they engage in. Every single dangerous offender, except I think one that's a woman in Canada, has been an Indigenous woman, and none of them committed a violent crime before they went to prison. So I say this to say that when we establish a punishment regime, it always expands. Now, as far as abolition goes, I'm not a doctrinaire abolitionist in terms of I actually think that if you're not engaged in prison work, it's it's dishonest in certain ways, because those of us who do work in prisons all have your moment, right, where you're advocating for somebody and then they've trafficked Black women, and maybe I've worked in scenarios where I worked with somebody who killed a friend of mine's sister, for example, and I've worked with Nazis. I've worked with people who have called me the N-word, for sure. That's not even new. I've worked with people who have shot people who I'm friends with and work with. It's a very complicated area, and it's not simple. It's not something that you just hashtag on Twitter, hashtag abolition. The first time you work with a sex offender over something, it's difficult. We all have that moment where can I do this with this person? And then you have to really think about what is the rights issue. Some people aren't comfortable and aren't going to do it. So some people I just can't do that. I'm a rape victim myself, or I was molested as a child, and I can't work with pedophiles, and that's fine. And sometimes you have that conversation about feeling really uncomfortable. So what I say is prison advocates have these moments all the time. It's not we're just prison's bad, yay, it's all easy. It's very difficult. We've all had the moments where we encountered people who were I don't know, I don't believe in prisons, but that person probably should be in one, we all have those moments. It's not
it kind of reminds me, me being an anti-imperialist. It's not an easy thing to be an anti-imperialist, because everyone always will come up with a very good argument why you have a war. Oh, Saddam is like Hitler, or this guy's like Hitler, or this guy's like Stalin.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you're sitting there going, and then of course you then have to proceed to push back against all of the talking points and the propaganda and stuff like that. So I know exactly what you mean when you say it's not easy.
You said nonviolent offenders, which is 80% of offenders. If we took, I don't term offenders, prisoners. If we took out, nonviolent, that would remove by 80%. I actually don't like that division, because violent, I know I work, most of the guys I work with are people who have been convicted of murder. I don't think they're unrehabilitatable. I don't think that it's unhealable in community. I don't think it's that there's no reparation that can be made. I don't mean here that victims just need to forgive people and move on. I mean, I don't think that what we're doing now is effective in addressing violence. People kill people often. It's usually drugs, right? Like, and so we have to look at decrim and the drug war and how that contributes to things. But I just don't, like, I've worked with people about violent that I'm not ready to say, yes, well, let's just abandon those people and say non-violent. Like, people are also rehabilitatable and transformable and can be accountable and can pay reparation in their own community and can make up for harm and can do those things as well when they have committed violence, which isn't easy. Transformative justice was developed by Black women who are victims of extremely severe violence, like childhood incest and abuse. They're not naive about violence. It's not people that are like, we just need to hug people better. It's people that understand that these systems do not actually work to intervene in harm. They do not work to give victims closure. They don't work to support healing from victims. They don't support healing in our communities, and in fact create more and more rifts and violences and oppositions. Like, prison doesn't work to do the thing we want it to do, and certainly not a mass incarceration machine. So there's a difference between saying Paul Bernardo is not safe and needs to be somewhere, and having a prison system that expands year after year and largely ends up with, people mental health, Black people, Indigenous people. 50% practically now of federally incarcerated women in Canada are Indigenous. Like, that's what our prison system is. So I don't think we could abolish prisons tomorrow because we don't know what we're doing. We can't even hold rapists in our friend circles accountable. So, we have it's not something we could do tomorrow. We have no mechanism of dealing with harm. We don't know how to deal with conflict. We can't even deal with conflict in our own movements. You can't even hold a goddamn debate with each other over, like, a political issue without people accusing each other of violence and harm, So if we can't even debate, how are we going to deal with people who have committed real harms, like people who have trafficked people who have killed people, like, these are real harms and like traumatic, deep harms that last generation to generation in the families that they have entered, and we cannot take that lightly, and I'm not interested in dismissing that. I just don't think prison as a system actually does the work we want it to do. What we want is for people to be accountable for that harm. When you are harmed, you want somebody to acknowledge that harm to you. And yes, you also want punishment. But what does that punishment, does it have to look like? What does 25 years in prison do that 5 years in prison do, that 10 years in prison doesn't do, that 50 years in prison doesn't do? What is happening in that prison? And we know, every study shows us that when people go to prison, they get more brutalized, more traumatized, they get re-entered into cycles of crime. It brings more harm. It brings brutality. It is a brutal system. There's all kinds of stories that come out about how guards end up sexually harassing each other and doing violence to each other. It's an incredible culture of violence that spreads from how guards treat prisoners to how guards treat other guards to how guards go home and treat their families. We see this with cops, right? Like the high rates of domestic violence. You cannot maintain a violent system and think that it only is violent to those who you want the violence done to. I'm okay with criminals experiencing violence. Well, then the person who administers that violence they take that in and they do violence to their own family. We saw this in COVID, where COVID spread into prison communities because you cannot contain what happens in a prison. So I do not think we are ready today. There is no way in my lifetime, even if aliens came down and offered to zap all the prisons, we ain't ready. We need to know how to deal with conflict. We need to know how to hold our loved ones accountable when they do harm. We need to stop being like, my baby wouldn't do that, she's lying. We don't know how to do any of that stuff, and we need to learn to do that stuff. Abolition is about building a different structure for doing that. And that means hard work. It means holding people accountable in our communities. It means actually working to heal that. It means coming up with actual sanctions that are effective and keep people safe. We don't have any of that in place. So I'm not naive about this, and I'm not saying we should just let all the people who have committed harm out tomorrow. I'm just saying that prison does not intervene in that harm. It does not prevent crime. It does not provide accountability. It does not heal victims, and I've been a victim of stuff myself. I'm not saying this as someone who's never been harmed, but we know that we can put other things in place. So we have to work towards that. What that looks like on a daily basis is that, yeah, we can start with nonviolent people. In Nova Scotia, we were able to release 41% of people during COVID from jail. There was no crime wave. Those people are unnecessarily incarcerated, right? So if we start reducing our reliance on incarceration, yes, if we want to start with nonviolent, or start with the woman, or start with everyone who has kids or whatever, however you want to work that out. And then we can talk about what that means for everybody else. But long term, the prison didn't used to exist. Prison is a relatively recent invention, right? We're talking about the 1830s. Before that, we used to execute people. And I'm sure in the Victorian period, everyone was like, you can't not hang people. You know, if you stick them in prison, they'll just get out, right? Like, we're always having this debate about punishment. So when prisons were starting, they were by Quakers, and they were supposed to be, they were a social justice solution. Like, how about we don't hang and transport people? How about we actually give people the chance to rehabilitate? And the idea was that you would read the Bible and do work, and this would, like, you know, fix your soul and your body. This is like, now it sounds horrific to us, right? Like hard labor and silence and contemplation, like breaking rocks all day, and then the only thing you had in your cell at night was a Bible, and this was like, turn your soul to God. This is solitary confinement, and we know how violent and disgusting solitary confinement is. But at the time, they thought that this would reshape you, and it was a progressive idea that just because somebody committed a crime didn't mean that you should just like murder them and like they should be gone, that there was a possibility for something else to happen. And now 200 years later, we're still like on that 1800 solution. Well, like, can't we do something else? Is this the only mechanism we can imagine? God didn't give us the prison. We invented the prison. So what, instead of being attached to the prison, what we need to think about is what reduces violence, what solves harm, how do we, if you've been victimized by a crime, what is it that you need? And how can communities be responsible for that? And how do we collectively deal when harm happens among us? And many cultures have done this without prisons. Prisons didn't exist like before this, right? So that's kind of a long way of just saying that, yeah, I don't think it's simple. I think it's extremely complex. I'm not interested in simple answers. Like, I'm an abolitionist, hashtag. I know how difficult it is because I like literally spend every day of my life working with people who've committed violence. I don't take it lightly. But I also see what happens in prisons, and I just don't think it's effective. And I think it just spreads violence into communities and doesn't deal with what we want it to deal with. Like, you know, people always say, well, what about sexual assault? You know, what, only 0.6 of sexual assaults and in a conviction now. Prisons isn't dealing with sexual assault. Like, it doesn't deal with domestic violence. We've had zero tolerance for decades, and domestic violence has gone up. It hasn't gone down. No matter who we incarcerate, it's not dealing with the roots of gendered violence. It's not dealing with the roots of rape. It's not addressing why these things happen. And, you know, pedophilia, which everyone talks about, pedophiles don't get, like, long time in prison. They get, like, 2 to 5 years. Pedophiles get less time than, like, black kids with a gun. So that pedophile is coming out anyway. So you're still going to have to deal with that pedophile in your community. So how are you dealing with that pedophile so that that pedophile doesn't reoffend? And we actually know that when you put accountability circles around pedophiles, they don't reoffend. They have low rates of reoffending if you have the appropriate accountability structures. But most people don't want to engage in that because, like, who wants to work with a pedophile? So churches actually end up doing this work. These are like COSA circles, and they're very effective. But, you know, nobody, like, really talks about it, because if you're like, oh, yeah, I work with pedophiles, you know, people are like,
uh-oh.
Is effective ways to deal with the child rapist. So, yeah.
Yes. Sorry about that. You got cut off for a moment.
Oh, sorry.
But
and we've been going really long, so sorry. We should probably wrap it up.
Okay, then. Okay. Before I get to my very last question, then 3 quick follow-ups, because you took the questions right out of right out of the paper. So okay. So in answer 3 of these. Okay. So the person who did rape, and maybe he raped more than once, maybe he did more than one sexual assault. So okay, so if prison is not the answer for that guy, which if he raped like a little girl or a little boy, he'll just be raped probably, like, like in the shower and stuff like that, and that's definitely not a like the death penalty. Like, nah, guys, please, like, stop that. But the person who does, like, commits, like, a rape or or something like that, what would be the solution to the serial rapist? Like would that person, like, would he be treated as somebody with, like, a mental health issue, like, and I guess you could probably say that about a pedophile who acts on his urges, that like is it better to treat it as like a mental health issue, or
no, I mean, it's also a criminal issue, right? It depends. I mean, there are some sociopaths that, like, literally don't care, like I've encountered a couple of, like, psychopaths in my time. So, I mean, that depends. Like, first of all, is it, like, why are they offending? Like, is it that they were raped as a child and they're playing out that trauma, which might be a mental health issue, or are they a sociopath that enjoys inflicting? Like, those are two different things, right? Neither one is
something. Yeah.
Before I get accused
like
of
something, like something like R. Kelly, something like R. Kelly, for example. Watching the documentary, like Surviving R. Kelly, it was obvious that, like, okay, he was abused by somebody close to him, and now he's abusing anyone and everyone.
Challenging to me, because as I often say, I don't believe in prisons, but like R. Kelly should be in one. So this is what I'm saying. Like, I'm not like a abolitionist for the sake of saying abolition. Like, it's challenging. R. Kelly challenges me. I watched that documentary and it's grotesque and I think he's disgusting. But so the question I would want to ask, maybe not so much for R. Kelly himself, is where do cycles of violence and trauma in Black communities come from? And what can we do on a communal level to begin to intervene in them before we start talking about the prison issue? So I have been a victim of patriarchal male violence in the Black community, and I have firsthand experienced how everybody capes for the man who is powerful, and everybody is willing to like throw the woman in the garbage. I have experienced that at the hands of an extremely powerful man. So like, before I would get into the conversation about, well, how do we forgive that man? How do we work with them? I would want to say, why did we side with the man as a community? What narrative is it here that when people talk about violence, we all knew what R. Kelly was doing in plain sight, and he was going to the local junior high and the teachers were letting him in to rape the girls. Why? Because they were Black girls and they didn't count, right? Everybody knew he peed on that girl on tape. Everybody knew, and everybody still went to his concerts and defended him. So I have a poem called this, Everybody Knew. Like, so before we talk about, well, what should be done with R. Kelly, which I don't actually have an answer for, but the question I want to ask us is, how did we get to the point that R. Kelly, in plain sight, people walked into the studio and he was raping little girls in those rooms and people closed the doors and walked away? This was communal. An entire community of people enabled this because his victims were little Black girls and nobody gave a shit. So that is a huge part of the problem. If you are a Black woman and you experience Black male violence, you will quick understand that nothing you have done in your life, no work, it doesn't matter how many people you've given money to, whatever, you do not mean shit to people, and they will defend the men. So we have to intervene in that first. How do we believe people when they tell us these things? When we hear about violence, how do we take it on? We need to stop saying that people are lying about this, and we need those immediate solutions of intervention. And right now that may look like sending the dude to prison because we don't have anything else, but the first thing we need to do is be willing to confront harm. Abolition doesn't begin with ignoring harm. It begins with confronting it, acknowledging it, saying that a harm happened. And then, do we have a solution? Like, if we had intervened in R. Kelly before it got to this point, maybe there was an intervention for him. And what would have happened if we could intervene when R. Kelly was being raped as a child? Then maybe he wouldn't have been there. And I'm not saying that excuses his behavior, but I'm saying there is a root for it, a root based in generations of family violence that we need to intensively intervene in. That whole family needed an intervention. And if that had happened and we were capable of that, harm doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's very rare that somebody just like wakes up and like nothing's been going on in their life and they're going to commit harm. It's all, every time someone commits harm, people are like, yeah, they were weird. They were online harassing people. They, had all these signs. They were leaving violent things. They were, mass shootings start with domestic violence. Like, there's all these signs of harm that nobody wants to deal with. And then of course, once a person's mass shot somebody, someone's gonna be like, oh, so you don't want that person in prison? Like, they murdered 30 people. And it's like, but I wanted us to deal with it before they murdered 30 people. And maybe if we were putting more resources into dealing with it before they murdered people, like if we had the resources there, maybe we wouldn't be at the point where they murdered 30 people. And that would be a lot rarer than it actually sadly is, even though it is quite rare, right? So,
but finish what you were saying.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that abolition, to begin with, we have to begin with what are evidence-based and effective interventions into cycles of violence. Where does violence come from? How does it develop? How do we recognize it? How do we intervene in it in its early stages? Like, we don't have resources for that. And parents will tell you over and over again that they start seeing signs in their kids, for example, call for help, and they say you're not getting help till they commit a crime. Like, they're like, my child is experiencing mental health problems. They're saying disturbing things. They're like, I'm worried. And until that person literally commits a crime, there's no intervention because we don't have resources, because all our resources are on the other end of policing and not on the end of intervention. So the first thing I want us to do is to have effective interventions when this behavior shows. And that means that when your child is starting to harass little girls at school, you don't excuse it because, he just, you have to intervene with it then, and maybe that child isn't going to then rape a girl, right? Like, so we have to believe and know that like there are interventions that can be made. The problem is, so we're so often leaving it so late that at that point, that once somebody serial raped a bunch of people, I don't know what you do at that. Like, I'm not saying Paul Bernardo should get out. Like, Paul Bernardo is a serial rapist who murders girls. Like, that's not something we can handle,
We can then get into the very thorny issue of Me Too, which was, I'm not gonna, let's not talk about all of the Me Too cases, because I think some, like Harvey Weinstein, I've seen enough documentaries on the guy in which it was pretty obvious that the guy has some kind of a mental illness that he just can't stop himself from preying on women and assaulting them. Now, does he deserve to be? Now, okay, we live in a world where we send people to jail, and if they are found guilty, they're found guilty. We send them to jail. But then so somebody like a Harvey Weinstein, who I guess you could say is like an R. Kelly or like one of those pedophiles, there's something not right in their head. Would you rather that? No, don't send them to prison, but get them the mental.
No, right now, I would say probably we don't have anything else to do but send them to prison, because we haven't built anything else, right? So the question, like what I'm saying is,
mental health, like mental health, like that couldn't work, or
well, that should be happening, in a safe environment, if you want to call that. I'm saying that the problem is that we're looking right now, we're standing in a system where we haven't resourced anything but prison. And then, we want to point to examples and say, well, yeah, this person is a mass rapist. Well, that's too late, so the problem is that we have to start by building interventions before at the point where, like Harvey Weinstein operated for years assaulting and raping people, and everybody knew about it. Another case where everybody knew about it. There could have been a number of interventions before it reached that point. So what I'm saying is right now, like I would never advise a woman who's experiencing domestic violence or rape, if she needs to call the police to keep her safe, I wouldn't be like, no, I'm an abolitionist. Like that's what we have right now. If somebody has their hand around your neck, call the fucking police if that's going to get the hand off the neck, because we don't have anything else. But I would say that we need to work on what would look different. Like, could we have a group of women in your community, or men that, like we could build up interventions in the community that are able to intensively be part of families and help intervene in family violence in very effective ways. We could do that, which would be much more effective than the police coming at the last moment when the hand's at the neck and putting the person in jail. But I recognize that if that does not exist, it's disgusting to say to somebody, well, don't call the police on your rapist, because you have to right now. So that's what I'm saying about, I'm not like a doctrinaire abolitionist in that I'm just like, well, no, don't, like right now, should Weinstein be in prison? Probably, because we don't have anything else. I do think that we can intervene in other Weinsteins, and we can talk about how power and sexual assault go together. We can talk about why everybody looked the other way. We can talk about money. We can talk about what is wrong in his head and like what would a mental health intervention look like. Certainly prison should be, when it exists, accompanied by those interventions, which are being cut in most cases by governments. We do not have any effective or even existent mental health programming in jail. So if people think you go to jail and like you trot around getting therapy, like that's not what's happening. Like those programs, like during COVID, there was no programming. People have been sitting there for 3 years with like zero programming. There isn't like when people go, you'll get the help in there you need, that is a fantasy. That is not happening. In Canada, we used to actually have one of the most effective pedophile intervention programs in the world, but it got cut under Harper because like who wants to spend money on pedophiles, right? So like, taxpayers are like, we don't want to pay for pedophiles, but it actually was effective. It stopped offending, but it doesn't play well politically. So it got cut. So we'd rather people go out and offend as pedophiles than actually spend money to stop them from offending in effective programming. Like that is a problem, right? So prison is not this place where you go and you get like really top-notch mental health interventions. Like it doesn't happen. So yes, that is needed, but there's so many things where we're too far along the road. So I'm not saying no prison for R. Kelly or no prison for the cops that shoot people or whatever. Like ultimately as abolitionists, yes, it means that no prison for the cops that shoot Black people too. Yes, that's what it means. We have to confront that. But right now, are we in a position to divest from that with nothing else in place? No, we are not. And it would be an absolute fantasy and dangerous to say, yeah, let's just open the prison doors tomorrow. You know, we don't even know how to, like we don't even confront our friends when they harm us. Like, things happen to us in front of plain sight and we will support the abuser. But sure, we know how to deal with harm. We don't know. So please don't take me as saying that I think we have effectively in any way figured out how to intervene in these things. I just think that continuing to believe that prison, when it clearly doesn't, we need to start doing things that are more effective. And as you said, that's on like the really hard end of things, like the dangerous offenders, the rapists. Now, 80% plus of people that are in prison are not those people. It's people that stole, it's people that had an addiction, it's people, you know, yeah, I mean, there's assaults and stuff. I think that stuff can be solved through restorative justice, through reparation, through other things. So at least we can start there. And then I don't know that people have a good answer. I don't pretend to have a good answer. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, yeah, I know what to do with the serial killers. I don't. But that doesn't have to look like a mass incarceration system that operates in the way that it does right now, that largely incarcerates Black and Indigenous people, that largely produces crime as a category, right? That does not incarcerate corporate criminals and those who pollute our environment and workplaces that kill people. None of that. All the bankers that steal our money, they're not going to prison, but the person who's stealing $50 is. The person who's robbing the Walmart is. And that is also a problem. So we have to understand that crime is not largely happening on this level of like criminal minds. It's like largely not serial killers. So yes, that is a real question. I don't actually think we should dodge that question. It's, you know, some people think of it as a gotcha question, like you talk about, what about serial killers? And it's like, oh, it's not a gotcha. It's a real question. Harm is real. Violence is real. We do ourselves no favors in glossing over it or pretending that it's not real or that people aren't harmed or that this doesn't happen in our communities. So we have to confront that. But that is also not like a huge percentage of the prison system as it stands. The hugest percentage is like nonviolent crimes, women in poverty, people with mental health, people with drug addictions. We can start there. And then, yes, we have to have a broader conversation about where does harm and violence come from? Is it arrestable? Like, I mean, intervenable. Like, what does that intervention look like? How do you identify it? What would be an effective intervention? And that takes so much energy. It takes a lot of people. Like, you know, anybody who's dealt with like, you know, a child or something in their family that's ill or that is, you know, the amount of intensive and like, and those options aren't there. And then if you are able to effectively intervene, people, it's years of like really intensive like work, you know, and that has to be individual for each person. But if we're serious about dealing with crime and dealing with harm and particularly dealing with like violence and intimate violence, we have to do that. So I don't know if that's a good answer. But yeah, I mean, I don't.
But then you know my second to last question would be, what would you say to somebody like Annamie Paul, the former leader of the Green Party, who I have to say this was a very good argument. She says that, hey, I want to see police held accountable. I want to see us stop over policing. But there are rapists and murderers in the world in which no amount of socialism is going to cure them of whatever. And that's a very powerful argument. And that's it. And it's an argument.
Like as I said, since when did the police intervene in rape? When does that happen? Like over 99% of rapes never end up in prison, and over 90% plus don't even see a court. Police aren't intervening in rape now. So it's a fantasy that the police are intervening in rape and domestic violence. That is not happening. That's the point, because we have a system that only works at the point where you're like, if you're violently raped and you can't be accused of being the wrong kind of victim and it happens to be stranger rape and this and that, then maybe we might possibly get you into court, or maybe the person might be convicted. So there's a 0.6% chance of that. Everybody else, you're probably not going to report. People aren't even going to acknowledge it's violence and rape. Like the prosecution is going to say there's no conceivable way to prosecute this because it's he said, she, like all of that. So they're not intervening in rape now. And this is what I mean about I want us in community, like when we identify violence, which there's always signs of, it's always happening, it would be more effective to have a community council of people that are coming in at that point with mental health workers, with violence specialists, with people that can do family intervention, with all the things that deal with those dynamics and deal with it then. That is what we need. not once the person has violently raped somebody. And yes, in that, in that sort of ideal version of rape, it's a violent rape by a stranger. That's not how rape and sexual assault happens. It's happening like with the person you're actually dating and you don't even identify it as violence. It's, all the ways that, people are being touched and harassed and molested and are minimizing it because people are gaslighting them into saying that wasn't really harm. It's happening within families as incest through generations. Like, these are serious issues. So since when do the police intervene in that? And since when does spending in Ottawa, $325 million on policing, and they can't even fucking stop a convoy from going downtown, and we think that they can intervene in like a severe issue like rape and sexual violence? They cause rape and sexual violence. Cops rape people. 8% of like rape by sex workers is like cops. In the missing and murdered Indigenous woman reports, the RCMP is raping them. Like, cops rape people. Cops commit domestic violence. They have the highest rates of domestic violence of like any profession. So how are they going to police it? There's a lawsuit in Halifax right now with girls that were, trafficked in the 90s. The police that were like the trafficking squad were raping those little girls. And had free, coming into
and I also, I don't know if you ever, I don't know if you watch my show, but like I had Whitney Webb, to talk about the Epstein human trafficking scandal, in which it's like all the scumbags of the world. You have like mobsters, the police, Hollywood, entertainment industry, CIA, MI6, Prince Andrew, like all colluding to traffic girls, to do sexual blackmailing on one another, and it's like, yeah, so.
So, you know what I mean? So, like, true, but no, like, police don't do that now. Prisons don't do that now. So the question is, what do we want to do about the 99% of sexual violence that never sees a court and never sees police? Are we just willing to accept that until it rises to that level? Or are we going to say we need to address rape and sexual assault and violence at their beginnings? And that means also working with children, like how we think about conflict from birth, how we teach children to understand their own emotions, how we family violence, which is often is exacerbated by things like poverty, by not unsafe housing, by, children that are exposed to predators because they can't be safe in the home. Like, there's so many issues, and I don't want it to sound easy. Like, I'm in some ways uncomfortable talking about it, like not to you, but the idea of like who would watch this, because I know it's difficult. I have been up close with harm, both personally and in my work. And I never want to give the impression that I think there's an easy answer. I don't. But I know that what we're doing now also is not working to intervene in any of this. And the people that we most want to, the occasional Ghislaine Maxwell that gets or Larry Nassar that get big sentences, but it's like 2 to 5 years for the average. People rape their kids and they get out in like 5 years. That's not. So what you imagine is
the mobsters, I mean, someone who does organized crime, do they mostly get a light sentence or what?
Well, I mean, no. I mean, they'll do those occasional crackdowns, like of the Hells Angels or whatever, and they get like big sentences or whatever, right? Like, they do the occasional sweep, and it's quite theatrical. But I mean, are Hells Angels and mobs like the mobsters? You mean the international bankers? You mean the trafficking rings like run by judges and like. You mean the crime that happens at the highest levels of government, right? Like,
no, the five families. Although it is kind of an open secret that the government has worked a lot with the mobsters. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover, the reason why he didn't go after the mob was because he was gambling with them, and because they had the goods on him as a cross-dresser.
But there's a ton of like romanticism of like white gangs, like Hells. So in Halifax, for example, you got a lot of people saying they wanted the Hells Angels because at least basically the N-words weren't running the streets when the Hells Angels were here. So like, there's also this weird. I mean, like that's all the mob shows, like this idea of like white mobsters and gangsters are like somehow like moral criminals, and then at least they're not like the black man with the gun, right? And then of course the black men with the gun are pawns in a bigger system of a drug war that doesn't come from them, of weapons. Like, we don't manufacture weapons. Like, as Chris Rock said, white man makes gun, no problem. Black rapper says gun, congressional hearing. Like, so that's not to, again, excuse the pain and violence, but it's not coming from us. Like, black people do not have the global power to like create and manufacture guns and disseminate them into communities, right? Like, that is not us. Like, we do not do that. So what about Walmart that sells the guns, right? Like, and so it's complex. Harm is very complex. And like, if we knew how to solve harm, obviously we'd all live in harm-free societies, and we don't. and harm has always existed, like in different ways throughout history. There's always going to be some portion. And like, yeah, I'm not advocating that serial killers, like, oh, they just need a kiss on the cheek and, a little hug and we need to just solve it. Obviously not. Like, yeah, like, but that doesn't look like a prison system. That is a very different thing than a system of mass incarceration that doesn't actually, as much as someone like Annabelle Paul fantasizes that it's full of, the serial rapists and murderers. It's not. It's full of Indigenous women who were raped as children. That is who is actually in our prison system, Annabelle Paul. Like 50% of our federal system for women is Indigenous women. They are not out here raping and murdering people. They are victims themselves. They are people that are descendants of generational violence. They have faced violence since the time before they even came out of the womb. They have faced violence. They've been through violence in child welfare. They have been through violence in relationships. They have been often suffered extreme cognitive damage from violence that impairs their decision making. And then, though we say we care about rape victims, and what about the rape victims? Those rape victims are sitting behind our walls. 80+% and 90+% of Indigenous women are victims of physical and sexual violence, and they are incarcerated at the cost of like $200,000 to $300,000 a year. And you're telling me that that is a system we should uphold. So before we talk about those rapists, let's talk about the rape victims. Most of the men I work with are victims of rape, often in institutions, and we don't talk about it. They are victims of childhood sexual violence that was never intervened in, and then men often internalize that and it comes out in violence, and then they're doing hard time. And I'm not excusing that or denying their harm, but if we hadn't put them in a youth jail where they were being raped when they were 11 years old, they wouldn't be where they are now. So let's talk about that state violence and how there's lawsuits out against like every single youth institution. So I want us to intervene first. I want us to come up with solutions that aren't like cops come after the fact. They don't come before. We want things to come in before. And that means if we continue to just only resource the cops and then say we don't have any mental health workers, so wait until they commit a crime, then you get crime. And you get violence, and then you turn around and say, well, look at all the violence and crime. Well, why didn't you resource the things that stop violence and crime?
Yeah.
Why didn't you do that? Let's do that. Let's try that for a while. And see
also,
what
and also, and also we also need mental health care to not be in private hands. That it needs to be merged with a single payer system.
They had a program here where, like, when they were family trouble, they actually would put a social worker as a pilot program. And the social work wasn't just like coming once in a while. They were like intensively in the family, like they're 24 hours a day, and it was very effective. But of course, it's extremely expensive, right? So as long as we continue to do austerity on like needed interventions, don't be surprised when crime happens. Don't be surprised when there's violence. If you're not willing to actually say, yes, when we start seeing a problem in this family, these are the resources that come to this family that intervene. And of course, yes, you're intervening in just like generations of harm. It's not easy. So I'm an abolitionist for the future, but I believe that we work for it today. So we work towards an idea of a world beyond police and prisons. But in the moment, we have to recognize that we are not equipped for it because we haven't resourced anything else. So I'm not naive enough to say, oh, you can just love people. Like, no, and right now, yes, like if that's the solution that there is, and you have to call the police to get a violent person out of your home, you have to call the police to get a violent person out of the home. And if that person is a pedophile, then they need to be in a prison right now because you don't have any other way to keep people safe. So I'm not saying that I want to open the doors and just let pedophiles run our street. I am saying that I believe there are other effective things we can do that certainly would minimize our prison population, and that we should be reducing mass incarceration, if that makes sense. But please don't ever think I'm expressing like, oh, poor pedophile, like. But
I would never think. I would
and recognizing that it comes from somewhere in many cases, right? And like, unfortunately, this is the generational nature of harm and trauma and violence. And so what you want to do is intervene in it so it doesn't go to the next generation, it doesn't go to the next person. So. Yeah.
Well, we end the show 1+1 with with the segments of the questionnaire. I'm still looking forward to this. So just before, okay. So all right. So we end 1+1 with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, perfected by Bernard Pivot, and later done by my hero James Lipton. Rest in peace of Inside the Actors Studio. So, Miss Jones, before I let you go and enjoy your weekend, Miss Jones, what is your favorite words?
Oh gosh, you think I'd be prepared for this? Like I haven't watched Actors Studio. Liberation.
What's your least favorite word?
Panties.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
People, relationships. Like, I'm very invested in like my closeness to people, like community. Like, that's not just something I say, it actually is. I'm very dependent on those relationships.
What turns you what turns you off?
About oh my gosh, fraudulence, grifting, people saying things and not doing it, people who claim to do work that don't do work. Yeah, like I guess just in general, like not doing what you say you do, like
Yeah,
being
not
about the
practicing
thing
what
that, yeah, like practice what you preach. Yeah. Like
what's your favorite curse words?
I don't know if I can be honest.
You can be honest. Go ahead.
Coon is a racial slur, and I guess like you know Kanye didn't get banned from Instagram for like stalking, harassing Kim, but when he called Trevor Noah coon, which is like the pot calling the kettle non-black, but I guess coon, I be calling people coons. Can I say that? I think it's a useful word to identify things. I don't know if I should have said that.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, well, Jones' favorite curse.
I literally proposed a book. I wanted to work on a book called Souls of Coonfolk to address like that class of people. Like Jill Andrews once called Chief, so MP Jill Andrews in Toronto called Chief Mark Saunders a coon, and then like white people pretended to be all outraged, like, oh, racial slur. And I'm like, no, like this is within, but this is only black people can talk about this, obviously, but
yeah,
a useful term. I don't know. I mean, I curse all the time. I hear from people, so I don't know, fuck, shit, like motherfucker, like, all of it.
What?
I like Bumbleclot.
Huh?
I like Bumbleclot, of course, the great.
Oh yeah, I was watching a Peter Tosh documentary yesterday, and I was like, oh man, I used to listen to that song a lot. All right, what sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise do I love? Actually, in terms of the absence of sound, because I run, so when you're running really well, you're silent. Like when your form's on. So like that is, when you're just into it, it's like you're tired. You're like as you go past people. That's a good sound.
All right. And what sound or noise do you hate?
I mean, that's a lot. I'm like quite sound sensitive. My own voice.
No, get out of here. I love your voice. You have a beautiful voice.
I get bored of myself. I'm like, are you still talking? Like,
No. I think I would know what sound or noise you hate. It's the sound of like those like those like windbags like Justin Trudeau or Barack Obama or Aaron O'Toole.
Yeah, I mean,
basically anyone from the CBC.
and like mindless chatter, like everybody, like, oh, people that say things like to action an item and stuff like that.
What profession? You already said like sound or noise you love, sound or noise you hate. Yeah, what profession other than yours would you like to attempt to do?
People always tell me I should go be a lawyer, but I don't think I would. I don't know. I mean, I kind of do a lot. Like, I feel like if there's something I wanted to do, I would like go do it. Like in my life, so other than
you kind of already do, like, if like a psychologist or you sort of already do.
Oh my God, I'd never be a psychologist. But yeah, I mean, like, I sort of in my work, I mean, I do so much. That is something that I'm grateful for, that I've so if I really wanted to do something, I suppose I'd just do it in some capacity. I'd like to write more books. Like if I could write novels, I definitely would, because then I'd be caking it and I wouldn't be talking to you, so because like novels sell.
What profession would you absolutely not like to do under any circumstances?
Prison guard, CBSA agent, military, anything like that.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Oh, say? Does God speak? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, my vision of heaven is just like everything that you love to do endlessly. You know, it's like all the family, you know, you would endlessly, like an endless family dinner, you know, where everyone you love would just be there effortlessly and you could just eat blueberries all day and your favorite show would have endless episodes. I mean, that's how I imagine it. It's just like the infinite. So I suppose it would just be God. Oh, I don't know. I guess God would be like, you tried, and then, you know. You tried, you did good enough.
So God would basically be saying, like, your friends and family are right there, go and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I think if God was like, look, you did your best, like you fucked some things up, you know, like, but you had a good heart, you know, you did what you could, and now go enjoy the blueberries.
Well, Miss Al Jones, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with the brilliant Al Jones, journalist, educator, social justice warrior, anti-imperialist, abolitionist, all around, wonderful, wonderful human being. Miss Jones, thank you so much for coming back on the program. I really look forward to having you back on.
You might have to cut into like 4 pieces and like dribble them out one by one. This is like this is 2.5.
That's okay. It's the Yuri Smatter experience, the Yuri Rogan experience. But thank you so much for joining me today, and best of luck to everything, and hope to have you back again. Very soon.
Take care. All right. Good to talk to you.